By the end of 1991, Square had their sights firmly set on securing the Western market. Final Fantasy IV, or 2 for Americans, had just been released, as well as the spin-off Game Boy titles Final Fantasy Adventure and the first 3 Saga games, the latter rebranded into the Final Fantasy Legend trilogy. Despite missing out on 2 mainline entries, Final Fantasy had managed to make something of a name for itself in the US, niche as it may have been. In fact, Final Fantasy seemed to be a bit more popular in the US. The English version of FF1 outsold the Japanese, and while each Dragon Quest was outselling Final Fantasy games in Japan, Dragon Quest completely flopped over here. Final Fantasy, for all intents and purposes, had a good reputation among American gamers. But Square decided this wasn't enough, and somehow came to the conclusion that the actual reason the US seemed so disinterested was not because FF1 was released years late and FF2 and 3 were skipped. No, they came to the conclusion that RPGs were just too complicated to appeal to us. On one level, it does kinda make sense. The gaming scene at the time was dominated by platformers and shoot-'em-ups, games that were conceptually much more high-octane and straightforward. But the thing is, RPGs already had a very devoted audience in the West, just not on consoles. The most high-profile RPGs were either tabletop games like D&D, or PC games like Ultima. But Square saw how Dragon Quest, a vastly simplified console take on RPGs, finally managed to crack the Japanese market years earlier, and decided they needed to do the same thing for Westerners. A vastly simplified version of Final Fantasy that could appeal to the casual console crowd. And so, in late 1992 came Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a spin-off title meant to appeal to Americans, developed entirely by Japanese staff members. Designed to combine aspects from all 3 existing branches of the franchise at the time, the mainline titles, Adventure, and Saga, but in a more action-driven and straightforward format to ease up on all the boring, obtuse text and menus that might make it more palatable to general audiences. And due to being shorter and simpler than the typical RPG, it would even be sold at a discounted $40 price point. It would also be the first Final Fantasy game released in the UK, although since Final Fantasy was not an established brand there yet, it would be titled simply Mystic Quest Legend. And Japan would make the game's purpose blatantly clear by calling it Final Fantasy USA. What's more, Square would make a real attempt to improve the game's English script off the back of FF4's stilted display, hiring translator Ted Woolsey to helm the US localization. And as a result, the dialogue actually comes off as very clean and natural, even if Ted evidently forgot how to spell the word attach. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest stars a character who is not given a default name, but the manual calls him Benjamin, and that's as good a name as any, so why not? Shout out to the, I'm assuming, unpaid intern who no doubt picked that name out of a hat and then never thought about it again. Your work has been forever immortalized. Benjamin is tasked with restoring the 4 elemental crystals in order to save his world from the evil Dark King, teaming up with a handful of other characters along the way. In essence, we have the basic premise from FF1, 3, and 4, but this time without any interesting plot twists, enemy motivations, nor character development. It's an elementary school fairy tale version of a Final Fantasy story, stripped of anything with any sort of nuance or meaning, and I have absolutely nothing to say about it. Like other RPGs, players still explore towns and dungeons, but battles are no longer randomly encountered. Much like Final Fantasy Adventure, enemies are visible on the map at all times, although they never move and will only engage with the player when approached. But unlike Final Fantasy Adventure and its Zelda-inspired combat, the battles themselves still take place on their own dedicated screens and play out in turn-based fashion. Your HP is now this Fire Emblem-style health gauge, but you can swap to traditional digits in the options menu if you want. Enemy sprites also change to reflect the amount of damage they've taken. That's cool. Enemies can also be more vulnerable to specific weapon types as well as the expected elemental weaknesses. And so Benjamin can swap between his various weapon types at the press of a button. Magic is split into 3 categories, White, Black, and Wizard, with each category having their own pool of MP charges. The player can have 1 additional party member accompanying them, and which character that is will always be dictated by the story. Party members default to being CPU controlled, but you'll probably want to switch them to manual ASAP, unless you like the idea of them constantly wasting spells and items. Overall, the battles are very much in the same vein as the Saga games of the time, albeit greatly streamlined and with traditional EXP. And in this case, only Benjamin actually gains any levels. Each party member joins you at several levels higher than you, but since they don't gain EXP, Benjamin always catches up before long. Your level also maxes out at 41, which is a weird number, and presumably the only reason it stops there is because that's when your HP maxes out. Okay. Outside of battle, the player is able to jump across single-space gaps or over chests, and each one of the player's available weapons can also interact with the environment in some way. Swords can fit inside narrow gaps to press switches, axes can chop down trees or thick brush, bombs can blow open weak walls or barricades, and claws can be used to climb rough surfaces. The world map has been vastly simplified, with any manual movement and exploration replaced with a grid map, similar to, say, Super Mario Bros. 3, with all the towns, dungeons, etc. placed as waypoints. Random battles are gone, replaced with set battlefield locations that each contain exactly 10 battles that the player can choose to trigger whenever they want, or not at all. And cleaning out a battlefield will reward the player with bonus EXP, gold, or equipment. The world map is split into at least 4 distinct areas, all linked in the center by the Focus Tower, which the player will return to multiple times throughout the story. Every time a crystal is restored, the player is granted a key that allows them to delve deeper into the tower and access new parts of the map. Dungeons are pretty lengthy, but tend to be very simple, with some very rudimentary puzzle solving and a basic boss battle in each. Although in a few instances you'll also need to find an item that allows you to clear fog or reveal invisible enemies. As I mentioned before, this game already has 3 different titles, but if I may suggest a 4th, it would be Fisher-Price's Baby's First RPG. I know I'm definitely not the first person to make that exact joke, but I'm repeating it anyway simply because it's just so apt. This game is so ridiculously bare bones as to completely remove any and all challenge. Basic item chests respawn, new weapons and armor are equipped automatically and cannot be removed or swapped out, and during battle, the player characters will basically always act first each turn, unless the player is severely underleveled, which is only likely if they've been actively avoiding enemies. While weapons such as bombs, arrows, and shuriken use up ammo, the game is incredibly generous about providing more, and even though gold and shops do exist in this game, they barely matter. Inns only cost minor pocket change, and while there are about 3 instances where the game offers a new piece of equipment for a few hundred gold, most of the weapons and armor are either found in chests or granted to the player as part of the story. Money was never an issue for me in this game. There are only 4 consumable item types. In basic FF parlance, these would be potions, remedies, ethers, and phoenix downs. And not only do chests containing said items respawn, but they're always handed out in groups. Basic items in 3s and weapon ammo in 10s. If you take advantage of this, you'll never need to actually buy anything. Seeds, this game's equivalent to ethers, are the rarest, being scarce in chests and only being available for purchase from a few late-game NPCs. But your MP charges are so generous that the only time I would actually run out is when I went out of my way to do so. Saving can also be done at any time outside of battle, and the save menu even has its own dedicated shortcut button. Not that you ever actually need to save, mind you. If you should happen to actually get a game over, the game allows you to retry the battle again and again an infinite number of times. At no point in this game is there ever any actual risk of losing progress. All of this combines into an adventure that lacks any depth or strategy, and that results in a very dull, lifeless experience. The game is never frustrating, but it's also never interesting. No, even worse, it just becomes annoying. One particular dungeon, the Lava Dome, ended up being horribly, unbearably tedious simply due to the large number of enemies and the fact that there was no singularly effective strategy for winning battles quickly. They weren't difficult, mind you, just unbelievably mind-numbingly time-consuming. The game is also pretty short. Getting to the end credits only took me about 10 hours, and my 100% save file, which in this game means maxed out EXP items and gold, only clocked in at around 14 hours. Even in 1991, this was short for an RPG. Now, normally I wouldn't consider a game being short as an inherently bad thing. In fact, in most instances, I prefer my games on the shorter side. No, length isn't the issue, it's a matter of the content. Short games can still be excellent if the actual game is strong enough to keep repeat plays entertaining. That's the philosophy platformers and action games thrive on. Replaying each level means you're getting better each time, and thus learning to play more skillfully, and that is a reward in and of itself. But RPGs thrive on longer playtimes because typically RPGs aren't inherently skill-based. They're strategy-based. They're not about being skilled, they're about being clever. But Mystic Quest has no strategy, and that's by design. The game was made for kindergartners. Not only that, but there's nothing to do in this game aside from the main storyline. 0 side quests. I mean, the battlefields are all optional, but are you really going to call those side quests? The biggest thing that prevents Mystic Quest from being a total botch, thankfully, is the soundtrack. It does make a pretty bad first impression just because the title theme isn't great, but after that, the rest of the music is all pretty good. In fact, it's way better than it has any right to be. I found myself humming along and tapping my foot far more often than I expected to. The battle themes all go really hard, and the town theme is pretty soothing. The soundtrack isn't quite on Uematsu's level, but there's a lot of good here. I'd suggest giving the songs a listen if you can, preferably outside of the game itself. It's not really worth slogging through all the boring combat just for some decent music. The early 90s saw Square constantly trying to crack the Western market, and this wouldn't be the last time, with the most notable other example probably being Secret of Evermore a few years later. But it's frankly astounding that they ever thought this, of all things, was what would finally convince average Americans that RPGs were cool. They wrote a completely milquetoast boilerplate role-playing story and slapped it onto the most brain-dead, most boring, and most baby-easy gameplay I've ever endured. It's almost insulting that they thought we would like this, that this might be some kind of big hit with Westerners. Quite frankly, playing this game, I'm surprised they even assumed Americans were smart enough to read. And whether this was intentional or not, the fact that this is what we ended up getting instead of Final Fantasy V just makes it all the worse, in case you were wondering if there was any injury to go along with the insult. The soundtrack and the game's brisk runtime are its saving graces, and the decent localization shows that Square was at least trying to put their best foot forward, but that still doesn't make the whole package worthwhile. You don't need to make an RPG for literal toddlers in order to appeal to Americans. FF1 sold better numbers in the US than in Japan, and FF4 was critically acclaimed. Clearly, we saw something in this franchise that we liked. It's not our fault that we missed out on 2 of the games. And man, those poor Europeans having this be their first impression of this franchise. If games like Xenogears, Parasite Eve, and especially Final Fantasy VII would teach us anything in the coming years, it's that you don't have to cater specifically to American players to get our attention. All you had to do was make great games and market them well. Mystic Quest is the completely wrong way to go about it, making something completely trite, pointless, and lacking any passion or charm. Mystic Quest goes far beyond just stripping Final Fantasy down to its most basic for the sake of pulling in new players. No, it just completely removes anything and everything that made the franchise stick out to begin with. After the massive success of the first Sonic the Hedgehog game, you'd think all would be well at Sega. Alas, the game's lead programmer, Yuji Naka, left the company due to pay disputes, as well as the reportedly ill working conditions and tight deadlines imposed on the development cycle for Sonic 1. Intending to find work elsewhere, Naka would be approached by former Atari developer and future Sony hardware designer Mark Cerny, with a proposition to join his new studio, the Sega Technical Institute. STI was founded by Cerny in 1990, with the premise of combining Western and Japanese game design philosophies by hiring employees of both camps. And after Cerny was receptive to Naka's concerns about working environments, Naka agreed to join up. Not only that, he would bring along several of the original crew from Sonic Team, including level designer Hirokazu Yasuhara. The most notable exception was character designer Naoto Oshima, who who would stay behind in Japan to work on the game that would be Sonic CD. STI's first course of action in the wake of Naka's hiring would be to pitch a Sonic sequel to Sega higher-ups, requesting an 11-month dev period to have the game ready by the next year's Christmas season. Sega of America, however, weren't originally keen on a sequel, thinking it was too soon after Sonic 1, and still lacking confidence in the character. A few months later, though, Sega would change their minds, and Sonic 2 began development in early 1992, now with only 9 months to complete the game. Sonic 2 has one of the most well-documented dev cycles in history, but I'll try to keep things brief. Early on, Sonic 2 was being worked on by mostly American STI members. Apparently, Cerny had filed for the incorrect work visas for the Japanese staff, and so they got held up for a bit in immigration. But once the Japanese staff finally started on the project, Cerny started to notice a bit of a problem with his Sega Technical Institute concept. Turns out, if you stick a bunch of people from two completely different countries into the same space to work together, nobody can fucking understand each other. The language barrier made everything a lot harder than it needed to be. The Japanese staff were mostly pleasant to work with, but level artist and future creator of Spyro the Dragon, Craig Stitt, has said that Yuji Naka was, quote, an arrogant pain in the ass, who tried to hijack and micromanage every aspect of the development cycle. Not only that, but the game had a lot of levels that didn't make the final cut, and the Japanese staff members were clearly playing favorites. Whenever it came time to make cuts, the American-designed levels were always the first ones on the chopping block, which frustrated and upset the Western STI staff. Stitt would later be quoted as remarking, "I'm pretty sure my stuff was the only art from the American side that made it into the game." What's more, Mark Cerny, the man who founded STI, seeing it not quite working out, would leave the company almost immediately, about halfway through Sonic 2's creation. Other gems of the game's development history include an early prototype being apparently stolen from an industry trade show and posted online. This Simon Y prototype, named so after the person who discovered the ROM file on the internet, is one of the earliest and most well-known examples of a leaked video game beta. Despite the stricter deadline compared to Sonic 1, the American side of STI was still diligent about playtesting and implementing bug fixes, and the project truly came down to the wire. The files were still being worked on less than 48 hours from when actual game cartridges were scheduled for production. Even the end credits didn't make it out unscathed, consisting of a handful of mistakes due to being programmed in last minute. But against all odds, and with a total number of around 100 people working together to finish the game, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 would launch simultaneously worldwide, a very uncommon practice for games at the time, on November 24th, 1992, a day that would be dubbed Sonic Tuesday. Get it? But the Game Gear version actually came out first, so we have to talk about that one real quick. Sorry for the pivot, but them's the breaks, you know? Yeah, the downsized portable version of Sonic 2 beat the Genesis version to market by about a month. Developed this time not by Ancient, but by a new dev studio named Aspect, who would become the go-to developers for the 8-bit Sonic library moving forward. The plot of this one involves Sonic having to rescue his new friend Tails from Dr. Eggman, who is once again terrorizing South Island in search of the Chaos Emeralds. Since the two versions of Sonic 2 were developed at the same time and by separate studios, they don't actually share a whole lot in common. No levels, bosses, or music were carried over between the two, although this version does feature a return to Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1. Green Hills Zone. And that zone's music would later be repurposed into the opening theme for Sonic CD. When compared to the 8-bit version of Sonic 1, a few basic changes have been implemented. Being made by a different developer, the game engine feels a bit different this time, and the hitbox on the rings seem a bit off. It's hard to explain, but it always feels like the game is leaving rings behind, even though it seems like I was close enough to collect them. You can also recollect lost rings this time, and slowdown in the underwater segments has been fixed. Although the game did randomly crash once or twice during those segments instead, so I'm not sure the trade-off was worth it. Just like the first Game Gear Sonic, upon collecting 100 rings, you gain an extra life and your rings reset to 0, which was never a problem until the one instance in this game where I happened to get hit just as I was collecting my 100th ring and the counter rolled over. There are no special stages at all this time, although the goalposts will grant random rewards depending on what picture they land on, and the shield power-up is conspicuously absent. They did manage to implement loop-de-loops this time, even if they did have to fudge them a bit. Due to technical limitations, the loops are automated once the player enters them, although you aren't likely to ever notice that during casual play. Sonic 2 on Game Gear has become somewhat infamous among fans for its weirdly difficult opening level, or more specifically, difficult opening boss. Once again, boss acts provide no rings to prevent you from dying, and the first boss takes place on a steep incline where Sonic struggles to gain speed and suffers from less manageable jump trajectory, which makes dodging these bouncing cannonballs a lot trickier than one would expect for an opening boss battle. And that's not the only spot where the difficulty curve feels skewed. Halfway through the game, we revisit Green Hills Zone, which is a super easy jaunt packed with rings and extra lives, but then its Act 3 is filled with these spiked pits you need to use springs to bounce safely over, and that feat is way harder than anything else seen in the level, including the actual boss fight. It feels like you could probably swap Green Hills and Underground Zone, and the difficulty curve would make a bit more sense, if it weren't for those spike pits being there. Chaos Emeralds are found hidden in the levels themselves, just like last time, although now they are always specifically in Act 2. The 6th and final Emerald is granted upon defeating the boss of Scrambled Egg Zone, and only if you have already found the other 5. And they really went all out hiding these things this time, requiring a lot more navigation and tricky maneuvers to find them. Sky High Zone, in particular, seems especially devious, requiring a string of blind jumps and perfect landings onto springs, while maintaining enough momentum to reach the emerald high up in the sky. I can't imagine anyone managing to find this thing without using a guide. Sky High Zone in general is also just kind of badly designed, as the clouds can either be treated as normal flat ground, springs, or completely thin air, with no obvious distinction between the three. You're just sort of supposed to guess which is which at any given second. It's really kind of dumb. But in any case, gathering all 6 emeralds doesn't just unlock a different ending, but also another entire zone, Crystal Egg Zone, the third act of which contains the final battle with Eggman. The fight itself involves circling the arena in high-speed tubes to avoid these fidget spinner bullet things, and waiting for Eggman to leave himself open to attack. The Game Gear's tiny screen space means it's constantly shifting up and down to keep up with Sonic here, which is annoying and kind of even motion sicknessy. And once again, I'd recommend playing the Master System version to avoid the tight viewing space. Not just here, but throughout the entire game. Only once you defeat Eggman do you see the true ending. And in the bad ending, I guess Tails just fucking dies? Like, what else is this supposed to mean? Sonic 2 for Game Gear has a few cool little gimmicks and set pieces that more properly take advantage of Sonic's speed, such as the hang gliders in the Sky High Zone, or the way you can skip like a stone over the water in Aqua Lake if you gain enough speed beforehand. There's also the times you have to navigate these bubbles to rise up to the surface without touching the walls or ceilings, a gimmick that would resurface just a month or so ago in Sonic Superstars. The tube mazes in Scrambled Egg Zone were actually a lot of fun to figure out, and this game also features the earliest appearance of a Robo-Sonic, an idea that would be revisited several times in the classic Sonic games. Overall, I would say it's an improvement over Sonic's first Game Gear outing, but at the end of the day, it's still nothing you should go out of your way to play unless you're a Sonic superfan. Here's a little story about me. The first video game I ever played, or at least the first one I remember playing, was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 when I was around 5 years old. Every day after kindergarten, I would go to a babysitter's house until my mom picked me up, and the babysitter's daughter, who was around my age, had a Sega Genesis. And as soon as I saw Sonic running through Chemical Plant Zone, I was hooked. I don't remember ever getting very far in the game, and I'm not even sure exactly how much time I spent playing the game. A 5-year-old's sense of time tends to be pretty skewed. But after a while, I remember the babysitter had to ban me from the Genesis whenever I came over because her daughter complained that I wasn't spending enough time playing with her. No, I haven't had many girlfriends. Why do you ask? The plot of Sonic 2 sees Sonic visiting West Side Island after his last adventure thwarting Eggman's schemes, only to find Eggman up to his old tricks again. And it's up to Sonic to stop him from completing his newest weapon of mass destruction, a massive starship called the Death Egg. Get it? The original plot for Sonic 2 was planned to involve time travel, with Sonic traveling to various time periods to prevent a horrible future ruled by Dr. Eggman. Remnants of this remain in the final game. Hilltop Zone uses the same graphical assets as Emerald Hill Zone, but with a different color scheme and dinosaur-themed robots, and that's because the former was originally created as a prehistoric version of the latter. Levels like Chemical Plant and Casino Night were also originally conceived as part of the Eggman-dominated future. While the idea would be scrapped for Sonic 2, there must have been some idea sharing or some crazy parallel thinking going on, as the time travel concept would be explored to even greater potential by Naoto Oshima over at Sega of Japan for Sonic CD the next year. Sonic 2 follows the same basic formula of Sonic 1, with a fixed order of levels, no warp points, and no save feature. Each zone is also now only 2 acts instead of 3, but this means that there are instead around twice the number of unique zones as the first game, so no level really overstays its welcome, and you're always seeing a change in scenery before too long. One level in particular, Casino Night Zone, would almost entirely revolve around Sonic's pinball-esque gameplay by featuring actual pinball tables baked right into the level geometry. The graphics have also seen minor but meaningful improvements. Sonic's sprite is a bit sleeker and a darker shade of blue, background colors tend to be brighter and with more contrast, and there are more graphics layers for parallax scrolling to increase the illusion of depth between foreground and background. Level design is still fairly open and intricate, but in general levels are slightly more streamlined than Sonic 1, with a bit more focus on high speed and spectacle, although there's still no shortage of platforming either. And speaking of speed, Sonic's max speed has been raised from its cap in the first game, and in certain moments, Sonic can even briefly outrun the camera, which is always just a cool thing to see. This speed would also result in one of the most infamous Sega marketing campaigns, where they came up with the term blast processing in an attempt to match Nintendo's Mode 7. In truth, this was just marketing bullcrap. The Genesis didn't feature any truly remarkable or unique chips or special features. Blast processing was just a nonsense marketing buzzword that the higher-ups came up with to try to wow consumers.
All using state-of-the-art blast processing technology!
Blast processing technology? Those are just phony baloney buzzwords to fool the simple-minded!
Blast processing technology? Oh, gimme!
In reality, it just meant, our games go fast. And most of the ground-level employees of the company thought it was a stupid term, but you know how executives be. So we've talked about what was changed or improved, but what was there in Sonic 2 that was actually new? Well, a lot, actually. Sonic 2 features an almost staggering amount of innovations and new ideas that are still seeing use in the franchise to this day. And frankly, I struggle to even decide where to start. I guess the most obvious addition is the one made clear right on the title screen: a new main character. Stage designer Hirokazu Yasuhara wanted to include a new playable character and co-op gameplay elements so that siblings would be able to play the game together. And Yuji Naka suggested that said character be cute to complement Sonic's cool, and that he be appealing to beginner players. Much like with Sonic himself, an internal contest was held among employees to design a new sidekick character. And the winning design would be Yasushi Yamaguchi's two-tailed fox, whom he dubbed Miles Prower. Get it? American STI members, however, thought this name wouldn't appeal as much to Westerners and wanted the character to be given a simpler name, more along the lines of Sonic's, suggesting Tails as an alternative. The Japanese team was really fond of their original name, though, to the point of programming the name Miles into the game at several points, and eventually a compromise was reached that Tails would be the character's more common nickname. Tails is a young kid who was born with a mutation that gave him an extra tail, and he grew up being bullied by his peers as a result. But when Sonic visits West Side Island, Tails is captivated by the cool and confident Hedgehog, and observes him as he explores the island, but is too shy to approach or speak to him. Nonetheless, Sonic can't help but notice his new follower and really doesn't seem to mind the kid, actually impressed that he's managed to keep up with him so well. It turns out Tails can spin his namesakes like propellers, granting him extra speed and, more impressively, even the ability to fly. It's only once Tails sees Sonic's personal biplane, the Tornado, that he overcomes his bashfulness and finally comes out of his shell, as Tails is a bit of a tinkerer and loves a good machine. Sonic bonds with the boy, and the two almost instantly form a brotherly relationship, and one of the most wholesome and iconic friendships in video games. While the Game Gear Sonic 2 was technically Tails' first official appearance, he was made for the Genesis game, and this was where he would be playable for the first time. In gameplay, Tails will either follow the player using pre-programmed AI behavior, or can be controlled by a second player. Tails can collect rings and power-ups on Sonic's behalf, but the camera will always center on Sonic, and there are no actual consequences should Player 2 die or fall behind, as Tails will always respawn a few seconds later and catch up to Sonic using his flight ability. You can even choose to play as Tails all by himself via the options menu, but notably, the player cannot actually make Tails fly themselves. It's just a narrative explanation for how Tails is always able to catch up, and so Tails plays exactly like Sonic. The fact that Player 2 can never permanently die can even be used to cheese a lot of the game's bosses, and it also makes Tails the perfect character for younger siblings to play as, which is more or less what the developers set out to do with him. But the multiplayer mechanics in Sonic 2 wouldn't be limited to just co-op play. A proper competitive two-player mode would be introduced as well, an idea Yuji Naka wanted to include in the first game but had to drop due to time constraints. Sonic 2's multiplayer took around 6 months to create, and used a graphical trick called interlacing to keep the game running smoothly and without sacrificing detail or fidelity. The mode sees both players competing to race to the end of the stage, but it's not just about being faster, it's also about collecting rings and points along the way. A combination of all 3 elements will determine the winner in the end. I've admittedly never spent a lot of time in this mode, but it runs incredibly well, and for those who may enjoy competitive platforming, I could see it being a lot of fun. While multiplayer wouldn't become a mainstay to the series per se, in fact it's absent more often than not, similar modes would be featured in Sonic 3, Sonic Adventure 2, and Sonic Heroes, just to name a few. Another huge addition made to Sonic 2 is the introduction of the Spin Dash. Instead of having to backtrack to gain a running start to climb slopes or jump gaps, a common complaint in the first game, Sonic can now roll up into a ball from a standstill and rev up to blast off in an instant. The Spin Dash would become an immediate mainstay in Sonic's repertoire, and completely changes the way players navigate the levels as well as tackle enemies and hazards. So iconic would the Spin Dash prove to be that it would even be retroactively refitted into certain re-releases of the first game, such as Sonic Jam, the Sega 3D Classics Collection, and the mobile phone and Sonic Origins versions. The Spin Dash feels so natural and essential to Sonic's moveset that you would just assume it was there from the beginning. The special stages were also completely overhauled. For one, the method of entering them has been changed. Instead of bringing 50 rings to the end of the stage, every time the player passes a checkpoint with 50 or more rings, a circle of stars spawns above the star post, and if the player jumps into them, they're transported to the special stage. This means the player is given plenty more opportunities to collect them all. Sonic 1 only offered a total of 10 chances to collect the 6 emeralds, but in Sonic 2, since every level can have several star posts, players have a lot more room for error and chances to practice. In fact, it's possible to gather all the emeralds before the end of the first zone. Emerald Hill Zone indeed. And just to prove it, here's some time-lapse footage of me doing exactly that because I'm a show-off. There are now 7 emeralds to collect as opposed to just 6, and the stages themselves are also nothing like the ones in the original game. Players now control Sonic from a behind-the-back perspective as he runs through a 3D-rendered half-pipe, avoiding hazards as they try to reach a quota of collected rings in order to win the emerald at the end. While initially the dev team worried these new special stages lacked the gameplay depth of Sonic 1's rotating mazes, more spectacle than substance, this format of special stage would prove to have incredible staying power. This half-pipe special stage concept would be revisited several times in games, such as the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic Rush, and Sonic 4 Episode 2. This style of gameplay was also kinda sorta the progenitor of the now popular Endless Runner genre of games, making Sonic 2 a bit of an innovator even outside of its own franchise. And last but not least, Sonic 2 would also see the introduction of Super Sonic, a powered-up form of Sonic using the power of the Chaos Emeralds. Once the player has collected all 7 emeralds, Sonic will transform into Super Sonic whenever the player jumps into the air after collecting at least 50 rings. Mechanically, Super Sonic essentially acts as both an invincibility and speed shoes power-up simultaneously, but every second Sonic spends as Super Sonic drains his ring count until he runs out, so the player has to move quickly and maintain their rings whenever in the form. Conceptually, Super Sonic clearly takes inspiration from the instantly iconic Super Saiyan transformation from Dragon Ball Z, and they even added the 7th Chaos Emerald, presumably to directly reference the 7 Dragon Balls, just to drive it home even further. Super Sonic essentially acts as a god mode to reward players who manage to collect all the emeralds, which is no easy feat, and lets the player blast through the remainder of the game without much worry of losing lives. Super Sonic can still die by drowning, crushing, or bottomless pit, but is otherwise completely impervious to damage, and being able to completely steamroll your way through the majority of this game is intensely satisfying. Sonic 2 is packed to the brim with memorable levels, like the iconic Casino Night Zone and Mystic Cave Zone, as well as the incredible Chemical Plant Zone. The opening level, Emerald Hill, is essentially just the first game's Green Hill by a different name, albeit with some new corkscrew paths for added spectacle. Someone who's already played Sonic 1 isn't likely to be wowed by Sonic 2's opener, but then you get to Chemical Plant Zone and it's like nothing we've seen before. This level sticks out among fans for a reason, with its striking colors, in-your-face music, and a good mix of speed and platforming. Throughout the whole game, in fact, level theming is really strong, and while I definitely don't love all these levels equally, I can say that I don't think any of them are boring on a conceptual level. I also can't talk about the game's levels without discussing the scrapped ones. Sonic 2 has some of the most well-known and high-profile instances of cut content in a video game. Levels like Wood Zone and Dust Hill Zone ended up being dropped fairly early on, and a level called, Genocide City Zone would end up being repurposed into the third act of Metropolis Zone. But before being cut, its name was changed to Cyber City Zone, after the American staff pointed out the historical connotations associated with the word genocide. Death Egg Zone was also originally planned to be a full level rather than just some boss fights, and this idea would eventually be implemented into Sonic & Knuckles. The most famous cut zone from Sonic 2, though, is no doubt the Hidden Palace Zone. It was one of the earliest levels conceived, and one of the last ones to be cut, to the point where it's actually still present on the leaked Simon Y prototype. The layout is mostly complete, although it lacks any enemies and the player can't finish the level due to an impassable obstacle partway through. Its removal from the game is especially surprising when you learn that it was actually meant to serve a narrative purpose. Originally, the player would be sent to Hidden Palace Zone upon collecting all of the 7 Chaos Emeralds, and it would serve to grant Sonic his ability to transform into Super Sonic. A reimagined and completed version of Hidden Palace would be included in the 2013 mobile phone release of Sonic 2 as a secret hidden level, which says something about the level of notoriety this particular zone held. That it would be restored and worked into a version of the game released over 20 years later. Sonic 2's level design in general places more focus on speed and spectacle than the first game did. Apparently they took criticisms of Labyrinth Zone to heart, and eased up on the underwater segments in this one. In fact, once you're past Aquatic Ruin Zone, the third level out of 11, there's no more water for the rest of the game. That doesn't stop the water segments from being infamous, though. This vertical shaft of rising water from Chemical Plant has become notorious, and often trips up first-time players. So here's a tip. Use this shortcut at the top of the level to skip it entirely. Seriously, this path bypasses basically the entire final third of the level, and provides you plenty of rings along the way, dropping you off right at the boss with an invincibility power-up to boot. Ever since I learned of this path, I never don't take it. Probably the most humorous example of level design in Sonic 2 takes place in Mystic Cave Zone. On one specific path, if the player fails to jump and grab this pulley to lower a bridge over a gap, they'll plummet into a pit with spikes at the bottom. In most instances, this would simply result in the player losing a life, but if the player happens to be Super Sonic, they're just stuck waiting at the bottom of that pit until their rings run out, since even Super Sonic can't jump high enough to get out. And all the while, Tails is just there repeatedly taking damage, like, dude, you're not helping. So infamous would this particular pit become that it would be reworked into the secret entrance to Hidden Palace in the aforementioned 2013 port. The difficulty curve in Sonic 2, all in all, is actually pretty reasonable. The early levels ease you in, the middle starts to offer more challenge, and the final third becomes legitimately difficult. Or sometimes just cheap. Metropolis Zone, the only zone in the game to be 3 acts long by the way, has become infamous for its large amount of cheap enemy placement. Seriously, these starfish, mantises, and crabs seem like they were scientifically calculated to be placed in the most inconvenient locations possible. But if I'm being honest, I think I actually hate Oil Ocean Zone the most. Not only is its theming just kind of another less interesting take on Chemical Plant, and its color palette is kinda gaudy in my opinion, but it has these stupid octopus and seahorse enemies, and involves a lot of boring elevator rides and rising platforms that make it kind of a slog. Sky Chase Zone is essentially an auto-scroller, but I actually don't mind it much because it's more combat-based than platforming. The only real way to fail is if you actively try to outrun the plane underneath you. As a kid, I'd always get stuck on Wing Fortress Zone because I didn't realize these cannons could be used as platforms. They blend in a bit too much if you ask me. The game culminates in a pair of boss battles aboard Dr. Eggman's newly completed Death Egg, the first of which is against a primitive robotic double of Sonic. I know enough tricks by this point to make this fight a cakewalk, but for a new player it's definitely a good challenge, as the robot's attack pattern is not telegraphed and can seem random, until you realize the order of attacks is the same every time, and so it's just a matter of memorization. The final battle against Eggman in his giant robot is one of my most formative gaming memories and one of the most memorable bosses among fans. While the bosses in Sonic 2 are all generally a step up from Sonic 1's in terms of challenge, this final boss is really the first in the series to look the player dead in the eye and say, "Do your worst." The player has to hit the robot in one of 2 vulnerable locations, and being off by even a smidge results in taking damage. And since you aren't given any rings for this battle, that means you have to start over, including redoing the battle with the robotic Sonic. Mastering the correct timing and jump trajectory to hit Eggman is your only option here. In total, you need 14 successful hits to win, all while dodging Eggman's attacks, and even the most skilled player can still screw it up every now and again. Sonic 2 again has multiple endings depending on whether you got the Chaos Emeralds or not, and Tails even has his own ending as well, bringing the total up to 3. And while I've neglected to bring up the game's music so far, composed by a returning Masato Nakamura, that's for good reason. Sonic 2's soundtrack is stronger than the first game's on the whole, and tries more to capture a sense of grand adventure inspired by the Indiana Jones films. But this game's music holds a very special place to me. My earliest times playing Sonic 2 predate my exposure to composers like Nobuo Uematsu, and while I definitely enjoyed a majority of video game music I had heard, all it ever was to me was catchy background noise. My relationship with video game music was very shallow at the time. It kept me entertained, nothing more, nothing less. That all changed the first time I beat Sonic 2. The music that plays over Sonic 2's ending scene was the moment I realized that video game music could mean something. Sonic 2's ending theme has this drama, this sentimentality to it that, as a 9-year-old, struck me far harder than I thought a video game could. Nakamura would even rework this piece into a full-length lyrical version for his newest album at the time, as a gift to the team that worked so hard to put this game together. And that beautiful, kind gesture, I think, sums up what this game means to me. I could sit here for the next several minutes and tell you about how Sonic 2 improved on the original in every conceivable way, about its incredibly successful sales numbers, its universally positive reception, its legacy, what have you. But that stuff isn't what makes this game great to me. What makes Sonic 2 so special is the feeling it gave me the first time I saw Tails coming to rescue a falling Sonic from the destroyed Death Egg. The way the music swells into a gorgeous melody just before Sonic leaps into the camera as if to say to the player, "We did this together." It was the first time a video game had me think, I'm going to remember this for the rest of my life. As well as collecting and playing video games, I also like to collect video game strategy guides. They're not something I typically go out of my way to hunt down, but I'll regularly go to mom-and-pop gaming shops and thrift stores just to check out their strategy guides. If I see a guide for a game I own or like, odds are I'll probably buy it. I mean, unless it's one of the handful of highly sought-after guides, these books typically go for really cheap these days, so what's $10, am I right? Strategy guides are becoming more and more of a relic of the past these days. What with online walkthroughs and FAQs and wikis and what have you, strategy guides just, frankly, are a dead market. You're telling me I have to pay actual money for a book that tells me how to beat a game when Google is right there? What's more, these books are written in the span of a few months based on pre-release builds, and are probably filled with tiny errors and falsehoods that can't be updated or corrected after the fact. The internet and digital media has rendered these things completely obsolete, since now there are dedicated fan sites and message boards devoted to specific games that can have all the in-depth information you could ever need about a certain game. But god damn it, I love strategy guides. Call it nostalgia winking, call me a boomer, whatever, I don't care. I love owning these things. In terms of actually being informative, yeah, online guides will always have the advantage in that they can be continually updated and corrected as we learn more and more about a game. But there's something about actually holding a physical book and flipping through pages that just feels so nice. Scrolling on a computer screen and clicking links isn't as satisfying to me as looking up a glossary on an actual page. And while we now have in-depth online guides, charts, and maps for any game you can think of, back in the days when Game FAQs was limited to Unicode text and crudely drawn ASCII diagrams, traditional strategy guides had the advantage of actually being able to, well, show instead of just tell. Yeah, online guides are objectively better these days, but as far as the actual experience of using a walkthrough goes, for me, nothing beats playing a video game with an actual book in my lap. That being said, not all strategy guides are created equal. Some are heralded as all-time greats, and some are looked upon as being one of the worst, and sometimes that's true of guides for the same exact game. You want a strategy guide for FF7? Well, make sure you get the Versus Books guide and not the Brady Games one. Ditto for Metal Gear Solid. I've been collecting and using guides for so long that I actually have a list of preferred and disliked publishers. Piggyback and the long-defunct Versus Books are at the top, while Prima is almost always my last pick. So, of course, they would be the most prolific and longest-lasting. Brady Games is usually somewhere in the middle, depending largely on who the specific author was for that guide. But there are also official first-party guides written by the publishers themselves. You'll most often see this with Nintendo games. Those first-party guides tend to be a bit bare-bones and sanitized in terms of writing and tone, but do have the advantage of being overseen by the actual company who made the game, meaning the information in them is normally very accurate. But for third-party and freelance guides, it's always easy to tell when the authors did or did not give a shit. Versus Books' Zelda and Pokemon guides are fantastic, but their Digimon World 3 guide? Very much not. Because why the hell would they care about Digimon World 3? This was clearly just a paycheck to them. In fact, some of the best guides I've ever used were unofficial guides, written without permission or license from the game publisher or developer. And almost all of those were Versus Books guides, who got their start as an independent video game magazine in the late 90s. Their unofficial Final Fantasy VII guide, written by a team of RPG fans using a Japanese copy of the game, quickly became the most sought-after guidebook for the game, being much more informative and carefully crafted than the officially licensed Brady Games guide. They even had the audacity to boast as such on their back cover, saying, "We don't spoil the story, unlike the official guide." Their Resident Evil 2 guide was also unofficial and is still my go-to walkthrough for that game. While they were still around, Versus Books engendered a very positive reputation from very early on, and now that the company is defunct, a lot of those guides have become valued commodities, with the FF7 guide in particular going for hundreds of dollars on the aftermarket. And I've seen their Pokemon books go for around $1,000. They even make a joke along those lines in their Resident Evil 3 guide, where they point out that publishing Pokemon books is basically an infinite money glitch. But if you want to save yourself the exorbitant price tag, the entire Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow guide is available as a PDF on the Internet Archive, and the guide on strategywiki.org is almost entirely plagiarized from that guide as well. But enough about me gushing over now-defunct gamebook publishers. I thought as a new mini-series on this channel, it might be fun to take a look at some of these guides that I've accumulated over the years, and talk about which ones are good, which ones are bad, and which ones are just kinda okay. I know this may not be everybody's cup of tea, but I really get a jolly out of these things, and maybe someone out there will feel the same way. Anyway, let's get to the oldest strategy guide I own, the Sonic 1 and 2 Official Sega Player's Guide, publishing date 1993. A lot of early 90s strategy guides haven't aged particularly well. A lot of the books of that era come off more as glorified ads or propaganda rags for the game in question, and on the whole, this guide is a very mixed bag. The introductory segments and little interludes on each page are written in character as Sonic himself, and a lot of the early localization quirks for Sonic are very apparent here. Sonic is overly chatty and makes a lot of puns. They're still using the name Robotnik and referring to Sonic's planet as Mobius, etc., etc. The guide even opens with the first issue of the Sonic the Hedgehog Archie comics, which would have debuted around the time this book was published. The layout of the guide itself is pretty haphazard, and it can be difficult to tell which blurbs are meant to be read first. This book covers both Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, including the Game Gear versions. But there are certain sections of the book where you can tell they've phoned it in. The console games get full maps and level coverage, discussion of the various paths you can take, and talk of the various power-ups and even Super Sonic. They even provide maps of the Sonic 1 special stages to boot. It's all very thorough and informative. Like, I've been playing Sonic 2 for 25 years and I had no idea this shortcut was here in Metropolis Zone. So it's always really cool to learn new stuff. But the Game Gear games get none of that in this book. We get out-of-context screenshots with text blurbs underneath, and that's about it. The console games zones usually take up a minimum of 3 pages, but the Game Gear zones are lucky to get 1 full page to themselves. The guide points out where each Chaos Emerald is in each zone, but there are no full level maps or diagrams. They just show you a screenshot or two of the Emerald and say, here it is. They did at least offer these charts of the tubes in Scrambled Egg Zone, which is much needed, but they really could have fleshed out these sections more. Sky High Zone in particular is one zone that really could have benefited from having a full map available. Because even with the explanation they give here, getting the Chaos Emerald was a frustrating experience. And seeing that this was an official Sega-published guide, it includes several merch plugs at the end in case you want a Sonic the Hedgehog denim jacket or whatever the fuck. The 90s were rad, man. Overall, this isn't really a book worth hunting down. As far as being informative, it's decent for its level maps, but in an age where a site like Zone Zero exists, it pales in terms of density. I do like that the guide is a bit more succinct, but it's nothing spectacular. If you ask me, 2D platformers don't even really require walkthroughs in the first place. They're very straightforward in terms of concept, and the book isn't even a particularly grand collector's item. It's got a gaudy piss yellow cover, and the art included throughout is very not great. This flatly colored line art of Sonic is stamped all throughout the book, and it looks awful each time. I picked this book up for like $5, and so it's not like I regret the purchase, and it's nice to have level maps handy without needing a browser open on my phone or whatever, but an essential purchase? Not in the slightest, even for... It's the holiday season of 1992, and you know what that means. Like clockwork, Wily Claus has paid us another visit to deliver us a Mega Man sequel yet again. And that's really less of a joke than you might think. Despite being an artist first and foremost, Keiji Inafune was basically in charge of the Mega Man series at this point. With another new supervisor above him and a team of new and old below him, he had become the cornerstone for Mega Man design philosophy. And with the team already having done everything they wanted to do with Mega Man 4, somehow, the next entry turned into Mega Man 4 but powered up. And indeed that came to pass, whether that be a good or bad thing. At this point, these games are actually getting really hard for me to tell apart. That's not to say any of the second NES trilogy are mechanically bad games per se, but not much changes between them compared to how distinct the games of the first NES trilogy felt. But if you were ever motivated to do a Buster-only run in one of these games, Mega Man 5 is probably the optimal game to do it. Charge speed is increased from Mega Man 4, and the charge shot size is also doubled. which is honestly ridiculous given how good the charge shot was to begin with. Other than that, the other major gameplay addition to this game was Beat, a small robotic bird built by Dr. Cossack. Yeah, let's see how long he stays a relevant character. Beat is cool though, another robotic helper you unlock after collecting all 8 plates hidden in the Robot Master levels. He basically acts as a homing missile that repeatedly targets any vulnerable enemies nearby at the cost of ammo, which frees the player up to focus on platforming and dodging attacks and such. And considering he's useful against all 4 Dark Men and the Wily capsule, it's worth recruiting him. Another addition includes the introduction of M-Tanks, which fully replenish your energy and ammo, but can only be carried one at a time. Oh, and they also tweaked the rush coil to be objectively worse this time, hooray! The Robot Master weapons this time are mostly fine. Nothing stands out as particularly bad or good, with maybe 2 exceptions. Like, you would think a weapon named Gravity Hold would be pretty good, right? Not really, unfortunately. Any space or time-based weapons end up being highly situational with few exceptions. You'll use it against Gyro Man, and that's probably it. I found it useful in moments where I was overwhelmed by groups of small enemies, who are most vulnerable to it, but it's still very much a situational weapon. Charge Kick is cool in that it isn't really a standalone weapon so much as an enhancement to Mega Man's slide move. It still uses weapon ammo, and so it shouldn't be busted out willy-nilly, but it protects Mega Man from certain enemies and hazards, with usually the only exceptions being the larger enemies. But then there's the Power Stone. This weapon is absolute junk. I'm frankly astounded that there are people who still say the Top Spin is the worst Robot Master weapon when the Power Stone exists. I found exactly one instance in the game where it actually managed to be effective. Even against the Robot Master who's supposed to be weak to it, this weapon is damn near useless. You're honestly better off just using the charge shot against Charge Man. Which, now that I say it out loud, does make a lot of sense. Honestly, picking up a literal stone and throwing it would be a more effective weapon, but that would basically just be the super arm from the first game. And to top it all off, Stone Man's stage itself is also overly long and uneventful, so fuck this guy. Also, just look at Charge Man. He's a little train, that's cute. Also somewhat notably, Starman's stage has effectively replaced the usual underwater level by using similar jump physics, which I thought was a nice change of pace, if only conceptually. Gravity Man had an interesting stage gimmick as well, with these arrows that changed the direction of gravitational pull. Oh, and my co-writer absolutely insists I point out that the napalm bomb in this game looks and behaves nothing like real napalm, but if you ask me, that isn't where his suspension of disbelief should be challenged in this franchise. To which he retorts, and I quote, "Let me use my chemistry degree as I damn well please." So, let's be honest, Mega Man 5 is just kinda here. It doesn't add anything to the greater narrative, it doesn't innovate Mega Man's gameplay in any meaningful way, and it really doesn't leave much of an impression at all. It gave us Beat, but that's about as minimum an addition that could actually be counted as an addition. No offense to Beat, he's perfectly fine. But looking back at what came before, nothing has changed. And look, I gotta be real with you guys here, I barely even finished this one. I've beaten Mega Man 5 before, years ago, but at a certain point during this particular playthrough, I just got fed up. Keep in mind, I'm not using an emulator for these games. I'm playing on actual hardware. I don't have access to save states or hacks or whatever. Game overs mean redoing an entire level, and frankly, I'm just not all that invested in the classic Mega Man series post-Mega Man 3 to feel so determined to see the end of each one. After my probably 9th or so game over on Wily Stage 1, I called it a night, and only after sleeping on it for a day did I decide to actually commit to beating the game. We're 5 entries in. I'm tired of the cookie-cutter Mega Man game design. Tired of running out of ammo against Robot Masters and leaving my only option as to get a game over. Tired of doing 8 stages in a row at the end of the game because you can't save in the middle of the Wily levels and whatever the fuck comes before those. I'm tired of having to beat each Robot Master twice per game. I'm tired of Wily's machine being a humongous pain in the ass that's only weak to one weapon that usually isn't very good or easy to use. Which, to be fair, was not the case with this one, but still. There's also this Battletoads Turbo Tunnel bullshit that they pull in Waveman's stage that had me pulling my hair out. It's all grown stale, and I'm frankly just not a big enough fan of this franchise for the formula to still land with me once I'm 5 games deep. By Mega Man 5, this series desperately needed some fresh air, and for the sake of my sanity, I need to be able to call it quits when it becomes too much. I'll at least finish covering the second trilogy, but after that I'll probably only be covering the Mega Man X games. So, see you guys in a few months for Mega Man 6, I guess. Over the years, the idea of replay value in video games has become something of a lost art. Games nowadays are less concerned with incentivizing repeat plays than they are with making the initial play as jam-packed with content as possible. Video games, on average, have been getting longer and longer for decades at this point. Fighting games, horror games, and platformers are still keeping short play times and replay value alive as best they can, but the biggest mainstream AAA titles tend to be made to last first and foremost. So for a genre that has always had a reputation for long single playthroughs, RPGs have never really concerned themselves with building in an intrinsic replay value. When getting to the end credits can take dozens of hours, most people won't feel much motivation to devote that sort of time again, if not much is going to change the second time. I can think of few examples to challenge this norm better than Final Fantasy V, possibly the most replayable classic RPG this side of Chrono Trigger. Released at the tail end of 1992, Final Fantasy V builds on the solid groundwork established by FF4. In terms of presentation, environments are a lot more complex and visually rich, with far fewer instances of the black void screen edges seen in previous games. They really tried to make each location feel like a fully fleshed out space, rather than a bunch of sprites mapped onto a black screen like in prior entries. The game's interface also saw a few tweaks from last time. A handy new Optimize option automatically equips gear with the highest available stats. The player's item inventory can now auto-sort by category, although any organizing beyond that still needs to be done by hand. But more importantly, item capacity is now, for the first time, unrestricted. You can hold every item in the game no problem. But if you're a fan of Fat Chocobo and are worried he was put out of a job, fret not, he remains as an Easter egg for the Chocobo summon spell. The ATB system returns, now with a visible gauge tracking each party member's wait time toward their next turn. This visualization allows the player to actively see which character is set to act next, and plan their next few turns accordingly. The game even includes a form of multiplayer, where a second controller can be used to control two of your party members during battle. This is a feature that wouldn't last past the Super Famicom era because literally nobody ever used it. The infamous Tonberry enemy also made its first appearance in this entry. Did I need to mention that? No, but I think Tonberries are cool, so I wanted to say something. One of the primary goals of FF5, according to Hironobu Sakaguchi, was to grant the player more direct control over their characters than ever before. And Final Fantasy V would do this by creating the most in-depth gameplay the series had yet seen, and possibly has ever seen. While the party size has been reduced from 5 back to the standard 4, that's perfectly fine in light of FF5 bringing back the job system. Hiroyuki Ito would prove himself to be a valuable team member among the FF staff, as after inventing the ATB system for FF4, which would define the franchise's battles for almost a decade, Ito, along with Akihiko Matsui, would repurpose the Final Fantasy III system into a newer, bigger, and better form. Characters can once again choose between a large selection of different specialties, and this time without all the fussing about with capacity points. Jobs can be swapped around at absolutely no penalty. Including the default freelancer job, FF5 sees a total of 22 different jobs. One fewer than FF3, sure, but 5 more than makes up for this, not only by replacing the more redundant jobs with completely unique ones, but also by being far more versatile and freeing than the initial iteration of the system. In addition to the jobs themselves having unique traits, the game also tracks each job's individual level, which increases via ability points awarded at the end of battle. Whereas FF3's capacity points simply affected how powerful a character was in a certain job, when a job levels up in FF5, that character gains an ability that can then be set to any other job they use. These abilities can range from action abilities, such as stealing or the various schools of magic, to the ability to equip weapons and armor that a job perhaps wouldn't normally be able to use, or even just straight stat buffs. You can also choose to pass on innate passive abilities as well, such as a ninja's ability to dual wield or the thief's ability to run on the overworld map or see hidden passages. You can only set one additional ability to each job, but this capacity for mixing and matching makes for a game with endless amounts of customization, experimentation, and replayability. And just as the cherry on top, every character has separate, unique sprites for each of the 22 jobs, which is just an incredible amount of graphical variety for a game of this era. Almost every job from FF3 returned in some form or another. I mean, I doubt anybody will really miss the Viking or Scholar, right? But this new version of the system ensures that none of those become outdated throughout the course of the game. Every job has unique abilities that can be used by other jobs. And mastering a job also means that the initial Freelancer class gains all the innate passive abilities and stat boosts of the mastered job. In other words, the Freelancer becomes more powerful with the more jobs you've maxed out. And in addition, the Freelancer can equip 2 job abilities instead of just 1, as well as use any piece of equipment. But even so, mastering jobs isn't required to become a powerhouse. Final Fantasy V, perhaps more than any other turn-based RPG I've played, perfectly embodies the school of play smarter, not harder. The entire game, each random encounter, every boss fight is like a playground to mess around with all the tools at your disposal, and you can get incredibly clever with it. The new Blue Mage and its corresponding School of Magic revolves around learning enemy abilities for the party's own use, such as 1000 Needles and the ever-useful Mighty Guard and White Wind. The Chemist on paper may sound lame, but its ability to combine items to perform various effects can really come through in a pinch. The new Beastmaster job specializes in interacting with enemies, being able to catch weakened ones Pokemon style to then sick them on another enemy later on. Or once it's gained a few levels, it can control enemies directly, which can be useful in learning some of those tricky blue magic spells. The new Time Mage can cast the horrendously broken Return spell, which restarts the current battle from the beginning, including re-rolling for things like preemptive strikes. And this can be used to retry a battle that isn't going well, or can help when you're trying to steal specific rare items. The secret Mime job can equip a whopping 3 abilities from other jobs, as well as repeat the last action taken by a party member, whatever that may be, without using any MP. Even bards weren't neglected here. While the job itself suffers from low base stats and poor equipment selection, leveling it up enough to equip the Sing ability on another job is definitely worth your time, as the different songs can inflict party-wide effects at no MP cost, and very few enemies are immune to songs. Everything combines into an RPG experience where your job level and equipment become far more important than your character's traditional EXP, and where abilities and special properties are often paramount over raw stats. Why equip an accessory that raises your stats when you could equip a Protect Ring, which grants inherent regen and protection against instant death? Or the Hermes Sandals that gives the character permanent haste status, essentially doubling the amount of turns they get. You could equip the armor that raises your defense, or just equip a Mirage Vest instead, guaranteeing that the first physical attack performed on you will miss, giving you just enough time to kill the enemies before they get a second turn. Why equip the Genji shield with its high defense stat, when the Aegis shield will just flat out block 1/3 of the magical attacks thrown your way? FF5 is a game where brute forcing your way through is the poor man's solution. The real fun comes in seeing just how ridiculously you can break the game in half. And this ironically makes that fancy new Optimize feature pretty pointless later on, as it will always prioritize stats over secondary effects, thus forcing you to manually equip anyway. But if you want to brute force your way through the game, nobody's stopping you. The dual wield and two-handed abilities both essentially double your damage output. Rapid Fire allows you to attack 4 times per turn with perfect accuracy. Combine that with dual wield and voila, you're now hitting with 8 unblockable attacks per turn. Combine that even further with the Mystic Knight's Spellblade ability, and you can also hit an enemy's elemental weakness with every hit. This game's possibilities are incredible. And Square knew they had a good thing on their hands, because Final Fantasy V was the entry that officially introduced the concept of optional superbosses to the franchise. While FF1 had war mechs, FF2 had iron giants, and FF3 had its colored dragons, those were all just incredibly rare random encounters that mainly serve to blindside the player should they ever come across them. FF5, though, has 2 enemies you can engage with in its final dungeon that are there specifically to challenge the player. Both Shinryu and Omega, I know a war mech when I see one, Square, are much tougher than the game's final boss, and defeating both are legitimate challenges that test the player's knowledge of the battle and job systems to its fullest. Remember what I said earlier about your job levels and equipment being way more important than EXP? These super bosses are perhaps the best representation of that. Most other RPGs that have optional endgame challenges would require you to be around level 70 minimum to even stand a chance. But here, you can pull it off in the late 40s to early 50s. Hell, I pulled it off at level 40, just by using the right equipment setup and strategy. It's really brilliant stuff. Defeating these guys gets you nothing but medals proving you've done so, being quite a literal license to brag, and it's not just the super bosses. The entire game is noticeably more difficult than a lot of the other entries of the franchise. And this is really out of necessity, given the number of options the player has at any given moment. They had to pump up the difficulty, just to encourage you not to over-rely on the same handful of jobs and abilities for the whole game. And the game even subtly nudges you into avoiding the usual OCD-esque tendencies RPG players tend to commit to. Keeping all your party members at the same level is actually a bad idea in a game where certain enemies have level-specific attacks. For instance, level 5 Death instantly kills any character with a level divisible by 5, and there's no way to block this. If you are of an applicable level, you die, period. But you still want at least one character to be hit by it, as it's a blue spell that the player will then be able to use themselves. And that thing I mentioned before about not brute forcing your way through the game, that even applies to how you build your characters. Leveling up every job on every character is an unnecessary and time-consuming process, as is just buying 4 of every piece of equipment to cover all your bases. That's going to be unbelievably expensive, borderline unviable. You're much better off specializing and spreading out your party's preferred jobs. During the game's third act, you're required to split your party to climb Fork Tower, each side of which forbids either physical or magical attacks, really driving home the idea that you should have characters that are specialized adequately in one or the other. The game's replay potential is demonstrated perhaps nowhere better than the annual fan charity event, the Final Fantasy V 4-Job Fiesta, wherein donors are given a set of 4 randomly selected jobs and tasked with attempting to beat the entire game with only those jobs. If they wish to change their current setup, they can donate more money to be randomly given 4 different jobs instead. And indeed, every sort of single job challenge for this game has been able to finish the game. The fact that any team can beat the game given enough resources and the right strategy proves just how immaculately designed and balanced this game was. I could go on for days. Final Fantasy V is one of the most versatile, liberating, and straight-up fun RPGs out there, and it's all thanks to the incredible depth of its job system. While future games like Final Fantasy Tactics and 10-2 would further improve and innovate on this system, I still believe FF5's rendition is the quintessential one. In my FF4 review, I voiced some qualms about how restrictive the progression and character building in that game could feel, and FF5 overcorrects this in the best way. But while the gameplay of FF5 is pretty universally praised, its story is a fair bit more contentious. Not that the story is bad, it's just noticeably more light than the entry immediately preceding it. The characters are for sure pretty paper thin, there's no arguing that, which is definitely disappointing after FF4's excellent cast. But the story of FF5 really isn't as bad as some detractors would lead you to believe. Penned by Sakaguchi alongside newcomer and future FF7 co-writer Yoshinori Kitase, it's a swashbuckling adventure story that harkens back to classic 80s shonen anime, which is honestly a pretty nice change of pace after FF4's non-stop and often relentless dramatics. In fact, FF5's plot conceptually is almost a remake of FF3's plot. It involves a ragtag group of unlikely teammates being bestowed the powers of the elemental crystals, which are shattering for reasons unknown, and by doing so, they threaten to destroy the balance of the world. Our group of heroes become the successors of the Warriors of Dawn, who saved the world from a similar fate 30 years prior, and the new team is tasked with solving whatever is causing the crystal's destruction. Just like in FF3, the group are granted new jobs upon locating each crystal, and even the villain, Exdeath, has a similar motivation to FF3's Cloud of Darkness, being an eldritch hive mind who seeks nothing more than to drown all of existence in the nothingness that is the Void. FF5 even repeats a side quest from 3, where you circle the world on a chocobo to earn a reward, which is just so oddly specific that I had to point it out. And the game sets its tone right away. If you're playing on a fresh cart with no save files, opening credits will play as soon as you hit the new game button, with the excellent main theme accompanying main character Bart's as he rides his chocobo through the lands. It's a simple sequence that sets the mood of a mystical and action-packed journey, and it does so very well because FF5's main theme is probably the most unapologetically adventurous of the series. As the game begins proper, you're greeted with a long sequence of cutscenes and scripted events, accompanied by probably the most ambitious score the series has yet seen. It's written like a movie score. In fact, the entire soundtrack of FF5 is full of this sense of grand scale and larger-than-life wonder, right down to the battle theme, which evokes not so much a feeling of tension or danger, but rather excitement. Harvest Hoedown is over the top and ridiculous in the best way. And Cursed Lands might be one of my all-time favorites. The drums during the final battle with Exdeath always get my heart pumping. And I can't be the only one who always laughs at Mambo de Chocobo and its stupid cheesy grunt. And of course, I have to bring up Gilgamesh and his associated theme, Battle on the Big Bridge. First of all, the song is the best work Uematsu has ever done, and no, that is not open for debate, thank you. Gilgamesh himself would become a series staple. Not only did he start the trend of Final Fantasy games having goofy recurring sidekick villains for the sake of comic relief, but Gilgamesh would continue to appear in future games as a secret summon or boss fight. And unlike with the Sids or the various recurring summon beasts throughout each FF entry, Gilgamesh is the exact same character each time, hopping dimensions through the Final Fantasy multiverse, so to speak.
I've been waiting in this Coliseum for so very long now. I was starting to worry that you'd never download this part of the game, and I'd be stuck in digital limbo.
But the game's story isn't all goofs and gaffs and hilarious hijinks. Conceptually, the game's story can get pretty dark when you really stop to think about it, even if the characters' flat personalities mean they don't always react with the appropriate sense of weight. Exdeath as a villain is actually pretty horrifying, a living embodiment of evil inhabiting a giant empty husk of metal armor, driven by nothing but the collective hatred of thousands of evil souls after a millennium of being trapped away in a mystic prison, and now bent on condemning all of existence to the same fate in petty revenge. His backstory is ambiguous and mysterious. Exdeath is not a layered or sympathetic adversary. He is pure evil, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with, which once again harkens back to the 80s adventure anime that influenced FF5's story, which often featured similar villains who were just evil for the sake of evil. And overall, the story displays a healthy amount of self-awareness throughout. If you were to describe Final Fantasy IV as a stage play starring the jobs from FF3, then Final Fantasy V, in turn, could be called a lampoon of FF4's ridiculous melodrama. All of the prior game's twists are cheekily skewered, right down to the main character secretly being the son of an otherworldly hero, Taking it even further, the game's entire first act almost seems written to be a deconstruction of the classic Final Fantasy formula. The crystals are under threat, like usual, but this time, the heroes don't save the day. The crystals still shatter, leaving the world in turmoil, and the party has to find another way to make things right again. It's almost like Square themselves was finally retiring the classic crystals plot in the most literal and direct way they could. I've noticed that most people who complain about FF5's plot tend not to make it far enough into the game to get past that initial crystals storyline, because once the game breaks away from that formula and forms its own story, it does become a fairly gripping tale that I feel gets far too much flack from those who never gave it a fair shake. The most famous plot point from FF5, though, is no doubt that it features the first instance of a long-term party member dying in the line of duty. Final Fantasy II and IV had minor and temporary characters sacrifice themselves or whatever, but Final Fantasy V was different. Its party was structured like FF1 or 3, where you have the same party of 4 characters for the entire game. There was no revolving door. As far as you knew, you were sticking it out with these characters through thick and thin. But near the end of the game's second act, your party is ambushed by Exdeath in the Great Forest of Moor, and the villain seizes this world's crystals and has the party on the ropes, sitting ducks to be plucked away at his leisure. But then, seeing his teammates, as well as his granddaughter, so close to death, Galuf manages to stand. In a blaze of glory, fighting even past the point of 0 HP, he fends off Exdeath, giving his life in the process. And the game doesn't pull any punches. Despite the remaining party members' attempts to revive him, they are unsuccessful. The game spells it out to the audience, clear as day. Galuf has died. Now, mechanically, this doesn't change anything much at all, as all of Galuf's acquired abilities, stats, and equipment are passed on to his granddaughter via what might be the most heartfelt scene of the game, but the impact of the moment isn't lessened by this. The characters, and by extension the player as well, have their resolve strengthened and find further reason to bring an end to Exdeath. This definitely isn't the most famous party member death in Final Fantasy history, as I'm sure you know, but it was the first of its kind. But that's far from FF5's only crowning plot point, if you ask me. The game's third act, taking place on the merged world, was a legitimately good plot twist that I don't think gets enough credit. You've just defeated Exdeath in what seems like the climactic confrontation of the game, scaling his castle of body horror and avenging the death of your fallen teammate. And even though you saw the world's crystals shatter after Exdeath fell, your party finds themselves back in their home world. This is it, right? You've won. But, amongst all the celebration, your team can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. And as you leave to investigate, you notice the landscape you had gotten used to during your initial trip through the first world has changed, quite drastically. And then, several areas of said world are suddenly sucked into the void, as Exdeath returns stronger than ever. You didn't win. Not at all. You played right into the villain's hands, reforming the two worlds into one as they originally were 1,000 years prior, setting the final phase of Exdeath's plan in motion. Final Fantasy III and IV similarly had multiple world maps, but none were delivered with the gravitas of FF5's merged world. And the game culminates in what is easily the largest and most ambitious final dungeon yet, wherein your party dives into the void itself and travels through the lost and shattered remnants of all the worlds it's consumed to confront Exdeath and finally restore normalcy. I've always said that the true indicator of a great RPG story is not when the ending makes you cry, but when it makes you smile. Not laugh, just smile. And Final Fantasy V does that. Seeing the characters finally succeed after so many failures, finally earn a chance to rest, and meet up again a year later to reminisce on their journey and pay respects to Galuf one more time, it just makes me feel all fuzzy, goddammit. And speaking of the ending, FF5 is the first in the series to have multiple endings, depending on which characters are still standing when you defeat Exdeath once and for all. So, I mean, that's cool. I can't think of many other Final Fantasy games that have multiple endings. All this to say, Final Fantasy V's story is good, actually. All that being said, I certainly don't love every little bit of this game. Playing through, I did find myself feeling a bit underleveled by the end of the first act, even though I'd been diligent about side quests and leveling my jobs. The barrier tower sucks because it's long and boring and every enemy is a pain in the ass, and the boss at the end of it is one of the most notoriously difficult. While we're at it, the Phoenix Tower kinda sucks too, but at least that one's optional. But the one annoyance that really permeates through the entire game is that it is an absolute nightmare for a completionist like me. The game keeps track of how many treasure chests you've obtained via this little NPC fortune teller here. That gives you a percentage right there and then, just asking you to obsess over it. But Final Fantasy V is full of chests, spells, and the like that can be overlooked and missed forever, as well as several areas that are either one-time visits or limited access, including 2 full-on points of no return that see specific old areas disappearing forever. And that fortune teller dude doesn't even show up until the game is basically over, so you can't even check your progress as you go. Someone aiming for a 100% run in this game is basically required to play with a checklist and keep multiple save files in case they screw anything up. While I absolutely adore this game when it comes to player choice and agency, it's a giant headache when it comes to being even a little bit thorough. So, after the intense amount of praise I've given this game, it may be a bummer for some of you to learn that Final Fantasy V was not initially released outside of Japan. While it didn't spend nearly as long in localization limbo as Final Fantasy III or even II, FF5 would be stuck in Japan for several years. Not for lack of trying, though. Final Fantasy V was indeed planned to be America's Final Fantasy III, and Ted Woolsey even had an English script almost entirely translated. However, the English localizers decided that the game was too complex and difficult for the average American, who, if the existence of Mystic Quest is any indication, Square was fully convinced were a bunch of stupid, drooling babies who can only engage with the most brain-dead of entertainment. Mystic Quest was created specifically to fill the gap left by FF5 with something more accessible in order to train American players on RPGs. Which is a bunch of baloney if you ask me, but I already did a whole video about it, so I'm not going to repeat myself. After this, at least 2 more attempts would be made at localizing Final Fantasy V, the first of which planned to drop the Roman numeral and market the game as a sort of spin-off title, but this was quickly abandoned. A second attempt would begin in 1997, after the massive success of Final Fantasy VII finally brought widespread mainstream interest to the brand. Developer Top Dog Software was commissioned to release a Windows port of the game under the title Final Fantasy Extreme, in reference to the game's heightened difficulty. But apparently communication issues between the Western studio and Square over in Japan resulted in that project being dropped as well. And after repeatedly having their hopes dashed over the years, fans grew frustrated and took matters into their own hands. A fan translation of Final Fantasy V would see release online in 1998, and was one of the earliest widespread examples of a video game fan translation. Even once the game finally did see an official English release on the PlayStation in 1999, the fan translation would remain the favored version among many. This was no doubt thanks to the PS1 port being pretty shoddy, and the localized script, based on the work done for the earlier cancelled PC version, was really bad, actually. And having played said fan translation for this video, I can say that while it's definitely not perfect and definitely shows its age, it is a remarkable piece of work for its time. If you told me this was a scrapped Woolsey script, I'd probably believe you. It does come off as a bit stilted and wooden at times, and there are a few formatting gaffes here and there, but I can definitely say I'd still recommend this over the PS1 version. I mean, if the officially licensed translation can have its "why burn," then the fan translation can have its "anda grande." And it's really because of FF5's late English release that the game has never really found massive popularity over here, which is a pretty stark contrast to its reputation in Japan. In a recent interview with the staff of Final Fantasy XVI, all but one of those present placed FF5 within their top 3 favorites of the series, and several of them had it as their number 1 pick. FF5 in Japan outsold all of the previous entries by a wide margin, and only barely trailed behind FF6 once it came out a few years later. The game even got a sequel anime in 1994, taking place hundreds of years after the events of the game, and this anime was localized into English before the actual game was. And evidently the dubbing studio had just finished a recording session of Tenchi Muyo and were like, hey, while we've got you here. But by the time Final Fantasy V did come out in America, we had already gotten Final Fantasy VII and VIII. And those games were lofty, ambitious, cinematic masterworks that were breaking new ground and pushing the boundaries of storytelling in video games. And in light of those, it didn't matter how good FF5's gameplay was. The average American simply wasn't interested in a 7-year-old 16-bit RPG full of bright colors and silly characters. And those who did play the game likely failed to understand the appeal or context of the original release. You mean there aren't any unskippable CG cutscenes? No minute-and-a-half-long summon animations? No depressed edgy boy protagonist? This isn't my Final Fantasy! Someone tell the guys at Square that RPGs aren't about building a team and going on an adventure. They're about watching some other guy build a team and go on an adventure while he whines the whole time. I mostly kid, but no, at the time, people just weren't interested in gameplay-driven RPGs. The majority of American Final Fantasy fans entered the franchise with FF7, which was this grand story-driven epic that spanned multiple CD-ROMs and potentially 100 hours of content. And I feel like if FF5 had been released in 1992 or 93 like it should have been, Americans would appreciate it a lot more. Don't get me wrong, those who have played the game typically have a lot of nice things to say about it. The problem is that it's hard just to convince people to even play the pre-7 FF games at all. And for some reason it feels like 5 ends up being overlooked more than a lot of the others, even being as readily available as it is these days. It also doesn't help that the game never got what I would consider an ideal English script. The fan translation is serviceable, albeit stiff and unprofessional, and the PS1 script is embarrassingly awful. It's like they took the first draft and just said, great, no notes. And while the GBA translation that's been carried over into every release since is the most complete and professional quality translation we've gotten, its tone is the opposite extreme of the previous two. It's overwritten. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for having a bit of fun and taking some liberties with the source material, as long as those liberties remain true to the intended spirit. But the current English script for Final Fantasy V contains jokes and quips during tense or dramatic moments, and these largely weren't present in the Japanese. I can understand the desire to inject some personality into a story that's commonly been criticized for being a bit flat, but did we really need the entire game to be written like an episode of Futurama? Like, yeah, give Gilgamesh some corny one-liners and pop culture references. I get it, his whole thing is being the comic relief. But why is every other character also trying to be the comic relief? I get what they were going for, but it makes it almost impossible to take even the game's heaviest moments seriously, and only furthers the less-than-stellar reputation this game's story has struggled to shake for years. It's bad enough we have to stop our own fanbase from calling the main character Butts. Can we not make it worse than it already is? That's not a joke, by the way. The main character's Japanese name is Butts. It's spelled with a Z, but yeah, it's Butts. The English version changed this to Barts, and there are fans who get unironically upset about this for some reason. Like, look, I'm usually all for maintaining the integrity of the source material, but maybe the Japanese staff should have done the bare minimum of due diligence to make sure the fantastical, foreign-sounding name they picked for their central character wasn't accidentally also the pinnacle of every American 8-year-old's sense of humor. Yeah, if you haven't been able to glean just from the sheer length of this review, Final Fantasy V is my favorite of the 2D Final Fantasies, and very well may just be my favorite Final Fantasy, full stop. It has near-endless replay value, and also kind of represents something of an end to the classic era of the franchise. After this entry, Sakaguchi would step down from series director to a producing role, letting the newer guard step up and take the reins of the series moving forward. And it's at this point that the franchise would see a noticeable shift in style and tone. While the FF6 stands would deign to acknowledge this, Final Fantasy VI sure has a whole lot more in common with FF7 than it does with FF5. But Final Fantasy V represents the quintessence of everything that made classic Final Fantasy, classic Final Fantasy. If someone were to ask me, what was this franchise like before 7, FF5 would no doubt be the first and only game I point to. Everything you expect to see in a 2D Final Fantasy is represented at its best here. And it's no wonder that prior to Final Fantasy IX, 5 is the entry Sakaguchi would name as his favorite. Everything he had hoped to accomplish with the original Final Fantasy was finally achieved in this one, and I absolutely love it to death. Final Fantasy V represents the heart and soul of the franchise's classic era. It is the definitive Final Fantasy. In 1993, the Game Boy was still dominating handheld gaming, despite its increasingly aged tech. Tetris was still a mainstay for most, and games like Super Mario Land 2 and Kirby's Dream Land were recent hits. And after the release of A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo in 1991, Takashi Tezuka got a Game Boy Zelda title greenlit for development. In truth, Tezuka had been working on such a game for years, with a Zelda game engine being the first thing he worked on when the Game Boy launched. He and a small group of colleagues had been moonlighting on that pet project right under the higher-ups' noses. Once development officially began, the plan was to make a Game Boy port of A Link to the Past, but this quickly shifted into an original project instead, with a story inspired by one striking concept: a giant egg atop a mountain that would, upon hatching, bring about the end of the world. When you think of first-party Nintendo games, especially those of the 2D era, the story isn't likely to be the first thing to come to mind. Mario is almost entirely gameplay-driven, and any plot is just there to serve as window dressing. Metroid is inspired by alien sci-fi, but those games instead focus on building a strong sense of atmosphere through clever and intuitive world design. But if there's one series where it feels like Nintendo has always been more willing to tell actual stories, it's The Legend of Zelda. By 1991, the series had seen a trilogy of games, the last of which in particular acquainting audiences more with the franchise's traditional setting, the Kingdom of Hyrule. At the same time, though, A Link to the Past could almost be described as simply a more fleshed-out Zelda 1. Now, that's an oversimplification that doesn't do either game their proper justice, but the fact of the matter is that by game number 3, Zelda stories, while bulkier than the typical Nintendo fare, weren't particularly varied. Somewhat unexpectedly, it would be the franchise's Game Boy debut, Link's Awakening, that would place special focus on storytelling. Allegedly taking place after A Link to the Past, although who really knows at this point, Nintendo treats the Zelda timeline like silly putty, Link's Awakening sees Link caught in a storm while traveling the seas, eventually shipwrecked on Koholint Island, where he is found by a girl named Marin and her father Tarin, residents of Mabe Village. Link is eventually told that the only way to leave the island is to collect the 8 instruments of the sirens and wake the Windfish, which lies sleeping in a giant egg resting atop Koholint's huge Mount Tamaranch. But he is also warned that doing so could somehow be devastating to Koholint Island. From the outset, Link's Awakening sets itself apart by breaking away from the usual recurring Zelda story elements. There is no Hyrule, no Ganon, no Triforce, not even Zelda herself. The team behind the game did this on purpose, as this allowed writer Yoshiaki Koizumi to spread his creative wings and not limit himself to a checklist of obligatory plot beats. Whereas previous games' character interactions were largely objectives rather than actual narrative, Link's Awakening places special focus on the player's interactions with the inhabitants of Koholint Island. Link returns to Mabe Village repeatedly throughout the game, and NPC dialogue will continually change to reflect the current state of Link's quest, and to comment on what's transpired in the plot. This means that characters will react to Link's actions in unique ways. For instance, while Mabe Village's shopkeeper will usually stop you from leaving without paying, if you do manage to slip out while his back is turned, every character will call Link Thief for the rest of the game, and should you ever return to the shop, the owner will kill you then and there. Actions meet consequences. Another thing that makes Link's Awakening stand out is its quirky sense of humor. NPCs will explain game mechanics, as is pretty standard, but then will immediately break the fourth wall by admitting that they have no idea what they're saying. One character will introduce himself to Link only to then inform him that he'll be stuck in the mountains later and to keep an eye out for him. A character named Alrira will give the player hints whenever they contact him from one of various telephone booths, but should the player ever visit him in person, the man is too cripplingly shy to speak. You could find a joke about the internet in there somewhere. It also features a plethora of Nintendo cameos. Tarin definitely seems to be based on Mario, but we also have obvious appearances from Mario's Goombas, Piranha Plants, and Chain Chomps, and is that Kirby? Oh, yeah, that's Kirby. Princess Peach even makes an appearance during a side plot about Dr. Wright from SimCity, here called Mr. Wright, get it? Being catfished. Damn, this game really was ahead of its time on internet satire, huh? Given the original plan for Link's Awakening to be a port of Link to the Past, gameplay does largely feel like a Game Boyified version of the previous game. Surface level progression is the same in that you clear dungeons to obtain the quest items needed to finish the game, and bosses also follow the previous game's habit of requiring the current dungeon's secret item in order to defeat. But there are a lot of small and subtle changes made to that formula that add up to make this experience feel almost brand new. Most obviously is that Link's Awakening allows the player to substitute their sword for a different piece of equipment if they so choose. Since the Super Nintendo had 4 face buttons and the Game Boy only had 2, the Game Boy Zelda lets the player equip any item to either button, and certain combinations of items can be used in tandem by doing this. Perhaps most commonly is the Pegasus Boot's dash combined with using the new Rock's Feather to jump so as to cross wide gaps. The overworld is also more clearly segmented than A Link to the Past was, perhaps to be expected for a handheld entry. Dungeon order is almost entirely linear in this one, and that's because certain areas of the world map are clearly cordoned off until you retrieve certain items from the dungeons. Early on, you'll need to find the power bracelet to be able to lift heavy stones in your path, then bombs, then the flippers, the hook shot, etc., etc. This makes Link's Awakening possibly one of the simplest Zelda games to clear without a guide. Once you understand which obstacles require which tools, the world map becomes fairly simple to figure out. Not to mention, the game feels the need to repeat tutorial blurbs every single time you interact with one of those obstacles, or every single time you pick up one of the game's temporary power-up items. Yeah, this game could definitely use some minor improvements to cut down on this stuff. Not only is it annoying to have to cancel out of every repeating text box because you brushed up against one pixel of a rock for a second, but those power-up items replace the in-game music with a very short recurring loop that can go on for minutes on end depending on how long you go without getting hit. Speaking of the overworld, the literal world map has been improved. Link's map is laid out in a screen-by-screen grid that's filled in as he explores new areas. Viewing the map will allow you to look up specific locations by navigating each square, making it easy to remember where certain shops, dungeons, and NPCs are, which is a smart move for a game on a black and white console where an unmarked map could just end up looking like a blurry mess. As Link's quest goes on, he'll gain access to various warp points scattered across the map to streamline backtracking. Although, I feel the game could have benefited from having 1 or 2 more of these. These ones seem a bit too spread out if you ask me. In dungeons, the compass has been improved. As well as pointing out chest locations like in the prior game, it also lets out a little jingle whenever the current room holds a key, which is useful because not every key is obtained from chests. New stone slabs in each dungeon can also be tracked down, which are used to read from stone tablets that can often provide hints on clearing puzzles. Dungeons also seem a bit less complicated than those in A Link to the Past, but are no less dense in the long term. I'm pretty sure there was only one dungeon that featured multiple floors, for instance, and said dungeon features a unique objective wherein you have to carry an orb to 4 different locations and use it to knock down support pillars to collapse the floor above you. Another dungeon has multiple possible solutions to navigate, and as such even contains a spare key to prevent the player from getting soft-locked should they take a less efficient path. New collectibles were added to the game in form of secret seashells, which are hidden in various locations and grant a sword upgrade upon collecting 20 of them. The magic meter from A Link to the Past did not return in this one, and so the magic powder item is now simply a refillable consumable item like bombs or arrows. This lack of a magic meter also means the fire rod is now essentially a 3rd sword upgrade, but considering the rod isn't obtained until the game's final dungeon, this isn't as broken as it may sound. Link's Awakening also saw the debut of the traditional Zelda trading quest, wherein the player takes part in a chain of item exchanges through various NPCs that ultimately ends in obtaining a powerful new weapon. In this case, it results in the acquisition of the boomerang, which here acts as a secret super weapon effective against most every enemy in the game. There's even a fishing minigame, which would become another semi-recurring element in the series. And reportedly, this minigame was put in by one of the programmers even though nobody asked him to. He just really liked fishing and wanted it in the game. The English version of Link's Awakening did see some mild censorship, but nothing too egregious. In Japan, this mermaid would refuse to breach the water because she had lost her top, but the English version changed the item into a lost pendant instead. And as a kid, I always wondered what this hippo lady's problem was, but I learned that in the Japanese version she was posing nude for this painter and would cover herself up whenever Link entered the room. The American version just kind of scrubbed that clean, but I doubt anyone is really broken up about it. Throughout the course of the game, Link forms a bond with Marin, who dreams of seeing the world outside her island and grows fond of Link. As to her, he represents the thing she wants more than anything else: freedom. She sees her isolated life on Koholint Island as a suffocating one, and confides in Link that she wishes she could just become a seagull and fly away. And indeed, the isolated nature of Koholint Island is brought to the foreground in a foreboding way. At first, the NPCs admitting that they don't know what they're saying comes off as a silly gag, but as the bit goes on, eventually you come to realize it's a lot deeper than just a meta joke from the writers. The inhabitants of Mabe Village start to reveal that they don't know anything about the history of the island, or even how long they've lived there. The very thought that anything may exist outside its shores even begins to cause them migraines. As Link collects the instruments of the sirens, he is repeatedly aided by this owl character, who, despite his willingness to point Link in the right direction, repeatedly warns him that accomplishing his goal could doom the island. Eventually it's revealed that Koholint and everyone on it are manifestations of the Windfish's dream, and waking it would mean the island ceases to exist. As you near the end of the game, the dungeon bosses express their desire to stop you, not out of malice or aggression, but fear that Link will cause the end of their very existence. Yet Link knows he must leave the island, and so he presses on. Marin does not realize the true nature of the island other than a general sense of dread that something bad could happen should the Windfish awaken, but she chooses to aid Link regardless. Using the instruments, Link plays the Ballad of the Windfish taught to him by Marin to enter the Windfish's egg, fend off the nightmare that keeps it slumbering, and then watches as Koholint Island disappears, along with all the people there he'd come to know. Link suddenly wakes among the wreckage of his destroyed ship, wondering if it was all a dream. Then to see the Windfish soaring the skies above him, along with a small flock of seagulls. The fact that this story exists at all is something of a wonder. Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto had very little to do with the making of Link's Awakening, and as such the crew were left much to their own devices throughout its development. This is likely how they were able to use all those Nintendo cameos without much fuss, and moreover, Yoshiaki Koizumi has since mentioned in interviews that Miyamoto would almost certainly never let him make a game like this again. And yeah, in the grand scheme of Zelda, we've never quite gotten another game like this, Majora's Mask being the obvious exception, itself a game with a somewhat similar dev environment to this one. The type of story told in Link's Awakening was not common for games at the time, especially not first-party Nintendo games, which tended to be built around fun factor first and foremost, while any story was really just there to add flavor. Takashi Tezuka has said Link's Awakening was the first Zelda title to have a, quote, proper story. And yeah, it's the first of the franchise where I actually felt the story was worthy of highlight in one of these videos. This sort of bittersweet, ambiguous conclusion was wholly unexpected. If the player manages to finish the game with 0 game overs, they'll receive a more clear-cut sign that at least one of the seagulls at the end was a reincarnated Marin, but otherwise the audience is led to believe they caused the end of these people's lives. Sure, those people were all just dreams, but they were dreams that Link was able to interact with and get to know as people, some of whom had real hopes and dreams of their own. And the moral ambiguity of what Link has done can really get the player thinking. We know Link would have to have left the island at some point, but could he have found another way? If we had tried a little harder, would Koholint still exist? Would leaving the Windfish in an eternal slumber be more humane than erasing all of Koholint from existence? Somehow, Link's Awakening did something once thought impossible. It used the much maligned trope ending of "it was all a dream," and actually made it work. And aside from just the game's ending, the story and setting of Link's Awakening is full of charm and a simple sort of beauty. One moment that sticks with me after all these years is a short quest where a ghost latches onto Link, asking him to go to the abandoned house on the Cape. Once inside, the ghost does nothing but take a look around, express a feeling of nostalgia that the house brings him, and then asks Link to escort him back to the graveyard. It dawns on you pretty clearly that this was the ghost's former home, and they just wanted one more look at the life they used to live before finally being put to rest. And the older I get, the more that sort of wistfulness resonates with me. The feeling of times long past that you can never reclaim, and accepting that those times are gone and that it's okay to move on. What a fucking beautiful game. A decade is a long time, especially for the world of entertainment. For a series to stay influential, let alone relevant, is a feat in itself. Such a milestone is meant to be celebrated, and that's exactly what Nintendo decided to do with their flagship Mario series. With the next mainline Mario game still in development for a few more years, Shigeru Miyamoto floated the idea of releasing a value pack containing all the console Mario games to date, which would also allow players outside of Japan the ability to play the Japan-exclusive Lost Levels. And thus, we were given Super Mario All-Stars. According to Satoru Iwata, it was a single game cartridge packed full of 10 years of Nintendo's rich history. It's worth noting how rare a practice this is for Nintendo. They don't really do dedicated compilation releases of old games. Oh, they'll re-release individual games over and over until the cows come home, and you can bet they'll charge full price each time too, but it's not at all common for them to package multiple titles together in a value pack like this. I mean, I guess you could count the NES and SNES minis as compilation releases, but even those were released in limited quantities and fairly pricey to boot. I can count the number of franchise-specific Nintendo compilations on one hand. There was the Zelda Collector's Edition on GameCube, which was a limited-time promotional pack-in game that was never easily available. Kirby and Metroid Prime collections on Wii, which weren't even developed by Nintendo themselves. And Mario 3D All-Stars on Switch, which was only available for like 3 months before being delisted. And compared to all those, Super Mario All-Stars stands out in that the games included aren't straight ports or emulation. They're remakes, technically. As opposed to simply porting the games from the NES to the SNES, all 4 were recreated from the ground up to fully utilize the SNES hardware. Soundtracks and graphics were updated to 16-bit, effects such as parallax scrolling were added, and certain glitches like the Minus World were fixed. But these are all minor compared to the addition of a save system for all 4 games, saving at the start of whatever world you're on, or whatever specific level you're on in the case of Lost Levels. They knew we'd need that. Mechanically, though, the 4 games on this collection were not changed. While physics were adjusted, the original games were run side by side to their updated versions for immediate comparison, to make sure the games still played identically. Now, that's a level of dedication rarely seen in these sorts of value releases. Keen viewers might have noticed that the Mario reviews on this channel have skipped a game between Mario 1 and Mario 3. At least you should have noticed if you know how to count. Don't worry, I didn't forget about Mario 2, it's just... well, there's more than one game that is technically Mario 2. I already kind of joked about this at the start of my Mario 3 video, because this is likely to be the first piece of trivia you learn if you're someone who's even remotely invested in the retro gaming space. It's the basic white bitch of video game trivia, if you will. But in case you don't already know, the actual Mario 2 wasn't released outside of Japan, had another game take its place, and then was later renamed Mario The Lost Levels when it was finally released internationally. The Japanese Mario 2 was made to be the hard mode for Mario 1, and when Nintendo of America was shown this, they worried it was too hard for the resurgent video game industry in the States, and asked for something easier in order to better market to Westerners. Thus, the completely unrelated game Doki Doki Panic, itself originally a tie-in game starring mascots from the Fuji television station, was modified into a second Super Mario Bros. Game. And Super Mario All-Stars contains those 4 games: Super Mario Bros., Mario The Lost Levels, Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3. Mario 1 and Mario 3 have already been covered on this channel, and since the versions included in All-Stars are largely the same aside from snazzy graphics and music upgrades, I'm going to mostly talk about the two games that are technically Super Mario Bros. 2. Originally released in 1986, Lost Levels is known for its difficulty. That's the whole reason it didn't leave Japan until this collection. Set in a parallel world to Mario 1, the games have the same basic structure, gameplay, and even assets and music, but Lost Levels contains 52 levels as opposed to the 32 of its predecessor. This game was also the first to truly differentiate Luigi from Mario, giving him his signature slippery traction and higher jump. Bouncing off of enemies for extra height was also introduced here, often even necessary for some of the more sadistic stretches. World 9 of Lost Levels is only accessible by completing all 32 levels. That means no warp zones. And while the NES release only gave the player one life to beat the entirety of World 9, All-Stars allows you to retain the lives you already had. Worlds A through D would also be unlocked upon completing the game 8 times, though this was thankfully changed to only once for the All-Stars release. So these levels can be played immediately after completing World 8 or 9. Lost Levels also introduced a lot of sadistic new gimmicks, such as poison mushrooms that resemble power-ups but instead function just like being hit by an enemy. Strong winds can also be present in certain levels, pushing the player forward by a large amount and making jumps difficult to predict. There are even some warp zones that only allow you to warp backwards. All in all, the All-Stars version of Lost Levels was made easier, and the original NES version didn't see an international release until 2007 on the Wii Virtual Console. Despite being treated as a sequel, Lost Levels really comes off as a ROM hack of Mario 1. Graphics and assets are almost entirely unchanged, you travel through the same level types in the same order, etc., etc. And as such, there isn't a whole lot to say about it that wasn't already said about Mario 1. It's just a longer, harder, crueler version of that game, and I really can't in good conscience recommend it to casual players. Lost Levels has gained a certain reputation in the Mario fandom as just being a miserable experience, and I have to say, I absolutely agree. If there is one game on Earth where abusing the fuck out of save states is completely understandable, it's this one. Very clearly, the odd game in this collection is Super Mario Bros. 2, originally released in North America in September 1988. This version of it, as in not the original Doki Doki Panic it was based on, wouldn't see a Japanese release until 1992 under the title Super Mario USA. Being an unrelated game masquerading as a Mario title, it plays wildly different than the others. Players get their choice of 4 characters: Mario, Luigi, Princess Peach, and Toad, each of whom have different properties. You can also change characters after every level, which opens up plenty of gameplay routes. Jumping on enemies does not kill them in this game, nor does the game feature any sort of fire flower or raccoon suit power-up. Instead, enemies can be picked up from above and thrown as a weapon against other enemies. And clumps of grass can also be pulled up to reveal vegetables, your basic projectile, and other items to throw. Some of the other items found within grass clumps are quite useful, like a stopwatch to freeze time, bombs for explosive blasts to clear out enemies and walls, and magic potions to open doors to subspace, a pocketed mirror dimension that turns all the grass into coins for the slot machine at the end of each level, and may also reveal mushrooms that boost your maximum health. There's no Bowser in this entry, as it takes place in the world of Subcon. Mario has a dream about Subcon under attack by the vegetable-hating Wart, and then tells Luigi, Princess Peach, and Toad about said dream on their way to a picnic. But as the crew is about to eat, they discover a cave nearby and decide to explore it, finding a massive staircase that leads to Subcon. After defeating a herd of Birdos and several other enemies, the team defeats Wart by kinetic application of vegetative matter. While they celebrate, we leave off with the "it was all a dream" ending, 5 years before Link's Awakening, though definitely not as impactful. Despite not being a Mario game originally, many aspects from this game became canon in the greater lore of the Mario series. Luigi was officially made taller than Mario here, and this game also gave him his little scuttle jump. Princess Peach made her playable debut here, along with her floating jump ability, and Toad was given his swift speed. Several iconic enemies also premiered here, such as Bob-ombs, Shy Guys, Sniffets, and Pokies. And while Wart has only ever made one other cameo appearance in Link's Awakening, Birdo has become a mainstay in Mario, though mostly in spin-offs, and not to mention is one of the first transgender characters in video game history. While Mario USA wasn't technically the real Mario 2, it ironically ended up being the one to make more long-lasting contributions. Lost Levels felt like something you'd find on GameHacking.net, whereas Mario USA actually took the gameplay in new directions and brought in characters, abilities, and lore that would stick throughout a myriad of other games. Unfortunately, you can tell it wasn't originally a Mario game. The level design lacks the sort of meticulous precision and intuitiveness expected of Miyamoto's team, but if you ask me, this is the real Mario 2. Seriously, fuck Lost Levels. Suffice it to say, the name sums things up quite well. This is an all-star collection. And it was only made better the following year, as 1994 saw the release of Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, which, as the title implies, also includes Super Mario World. And this became the pack-in title for the Super Nintendo for quite some time. World was mostly unchanged, save for Luigi's sprites being updated to make him more distinct and not just a palette swap. Of the scarce Nintendo compilation releases, Mario All-Stars was the one that feels like it had the most effort put into it. Completely rebuilding 4 classic games is no doubt a daunting task, and companies should look back to this collection, the care that went into it, and the standard it set, as opposed to some of the lackluster and frankly awful compilations we've gotten since. If you love platformers and yet somehow haven't played any of these games, this is the way to go, as I believe these truly are the definitive version. You know, gaming YouTubers have gained a certain reputation for just complaining all the time, but despite what my Mystic Quest video led some to believe, I don't set out to make my videos inherently negative. I'll bring up criticisms where I think they're fair, but I also go out of my way to give each game its fair due. Game development takes a lot of time, talent, and hard work, and I don't want to disparage any team that was just trying to make a good product. And since the whole point of this video series is that I'm reviewing games I already personally own, it of course makes sense that I wouldn't have gone out of my way to buy a game that I wasn't confident I'd enjoy, to at least some extent. Some of these games I've owned and played for decades. Others I've had sitting around but have simply never gotten around to playing them. And others still I buy on a whim, out of recommendation or word of mouth alone. And Secret of Mana fits in that last category. It's a game I've been aware of for most of my time as a gamer, and if you're anyone who's remotely into the JRPG genre, you've no doubt at least heard of it. It's considered a classic, one that pushed new boundaries and redefined what RPG combat could be, and with a visual style and soundtrack that won the hearts of RPG lovers the world over. Secret of Mana is a game I desperately wanted to love, but upon finally playing it, I honestly don't know what to make of it. Secret of Mana is a sequel to Final Fantasy Adventure, which in Japan was called Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. Yes, despite all the people claiming otherwise, the Mana series was labeled as a Final Fantasy spin-off, even in Japan. Originally, Secret of Mana was codenamed Project Chrono Trigger, but development would eventually split into 2 teams. One group would go on to create, Chrono Trigger, while the other would make Secret of Mana. FF Adventure director Koichi Ishii returned for the Mana project alongside Final Fantasy III game designer Hiromichi Tanaka, who joined the Mana team after stepping down from FF4. As such, a lot of his ideas for that game would be incorporated here, namely action-based combat and a cohesive and dynamic world map. And he would also be placed in charge of the game's story. Also from the FF3 team was programmer Nasir Jabeli, who briefly returned to Square after a years-long break following the renewal of his work visa. Hiromichi Tanaka has said that in many ways, Secret of Mana itself is a spiritual sequel to Final Fantasy III, greatly expanded and reimagined for the Super Nintendo. Secret of Mana tells the tale of a boy named Randy, who is banished from his village after accidentally claiming the legendary Mana Sword from its resting place, unleashing monsters into the surrounding lands. But encouraged by the wandering hero Gemma to restore power to the sword by visiting the 8 Mana Temples, Randy embarks on a world-spanning quest to thwart the evil empire attempting world domination, as well as find a way to restore the world's waning source of mana, the mystical force that gives life to all. Secret of Mana follows in the footsteps of Final Fantasy Adventure, featuring Zelda-inspired action combat with the player's attacks utilizing a power meter that determines the strength of each strike. Mashing the button to mindlessly swing your weapon is futile, as swings executed at any less than 100% power will fail to make any sort of significant dent on enemies, giving every attack a clear wind-up and cooldown period. In a way, this mimics the turn-based nature of the typical RPGs of the time, but in a real-time setting. Characters can move and attack as the player wants, but waiting for the ideal time to strike is essential, as in addition to the power meter, enemies are also granted mercy frames as well as power up and cooldown just like the player is, so attacking at just the right time is crucial. Where Final Fantasy Adventure had the player leveling up their power gauge to make their weapons stronger, Secret of Mana instead has the weapons themselves level up FF2 style, after using specific orbs, normally rewarded from defeating bosses, to craft improved versions. Likewise, once the player is granted access to magic, the various spell elements can also gain a new level every time the player reaches one of the mana temples. But perhaps the most significant addition to the sequel is the incorporation of multiple party members. FF Adventure just saw a few supporting characters temporarily join the party, and said characters were static, with no customization or even capacity for leveling up. But Secret of Mana sees Randy eventually traveling in a 3-person party for the majority of the game. The player can swap to control any of the 3 characters at the press of a button, and while characters not currently being controlled will act on customizable AI behavior, the player can also issue commands to any character on the fly by using various pop-up menus. But furthermore, once the dev team started incorporating a multi-character party into the game, they eventually realized that it would also be possible to add co-op gameplay. And thus, what is possibly Secret of Mana's biggest selling point was conceived: full multiplayer support, allowing 2 or even 3 people to play simultaneously, with the presence of a third player being made possible via the Super Nintendo's multi-tap peripheral. Yeah, the SNES had a multi-tap too, guys. It wasn't just a PlayStation thing. Secret of Mana, at least in single player, is hard for me to put into words. Like I said at the top of the video, this is a game with which I can't really seem to process my feelings. I certainly don't think it's a bad game, but I've played it twice now, both within the last year, and despite playing long enough to max out all my characters' levels, weapons, and spells, I never really reached a point where it felt like the game fully clicked with me. It took me almost a full 30 minutes to make heads or tails of the game's UI, for one thing. The menus are all laid out in a series of rings, which I'm sure at the time felt refreshing, but why are weapons, items, and spells on their own rings separate from stats and armor? It's not like spells or weapons have their own shortcut buttons, you still have to scroll to them regardless. And I can't begin to imagine what this would all be like in multiplayer. The game pauses every time you open a menu to cast spells or use items or whatever, and with 3 players, I can see that getting really irritating really fast. Look, I know the standard list style of menu design is boring, but it's also simple and easy to understand and smooth to navigate. I have no idea why game designers are so averse to just using freaking lists. I much prefer that over a bunch of flashy visual clutter. And can I also personally advocate that we petition for some sort of industry standard on which button scrolls which direction on a ring? I'm tired of having to guess whether pressing right will move me clockwise or counterclockwise. And while I'm at it, why is the default control scheme so weird here? I mean, you can change it in the options menu, so it's not like it's really a big deal, but B is confirm and Y is cancel? I could understand swapping A and B maybe, but like, what? The A button performs a dash, and I don't think I ever found any real practical use for this, considering you can only use it in a straight line, and it immediately drains the energy meter you could otherwise be using to attack. X and Y both open menus, Y for the character being controlled, and X to toggle your party members' menus. And I was constantly getting those mixed up because of course you would. It's all completely nonsensical. It also just kinda sucks that the screen doesn't center on the character you're controlling. It only scrolls when your characters approach the edge of the screen, and so you're often getting ambushed by enemies that you couldn't see ahead of time. I guess this was done for multiplayer purposes so that players can't be edged off the screen by other players, but I still thought it was a bit annoying. I couldn't help but notice a few pacing issues too. The first entire third or so of the game takes place entirely in the lower lands, repeatedly backtracking as you head to your various objectives. The next third of the game is split between the Upper Lands, Ice Country, and Imperial Lands. And then once you get access to your magical flying fur dragon, every remaining location in the game is shoved into the last stretch before the final dungeon. The pacing at the start of the game seems damn near glacial, but by the end you're being rapidly force-fed a seemingly random list of objectives with no real rhyme or reason connecting one to the other. It's like the game designers realized they hadn't given the player any chances to explore a majority of the world map and panicked, unable to come up with any real cohesive narrative tissue, and so they just gave you a bunch of fetch quests instead. Even worse, the end of each fetch quest has you scaling this mountain and talking to this NPC to be told your next objective, and they have you do this like 8 fucking times. This was easily my least favorite stretch of the game. But really, I think the biggest reason Secret of Mana left me so conflicted all comes down to the battle system. RPGs live or die on their battles. Most of the time spent in these games is going to be spent mindlessly killing things, and if that process is overly obtuse, complicated, or even just plain boring, it's not going to be a particularly great experience. Secret of Mana, like FF Adventure before it, took steps to break away from menu-driven turn-based combat that had thus far, in the eyes of many, been holding RPGs back. But Square was also clearly choosing to stick to what they knew best, and so a lot of RPG elements are still present in spades. Damage output is determined by a mix of stats and dice rolls. Characters gain EXP and level up, you buy new armor and restore HP and MP at inns, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's also trying to be a Zelda-style action-adventure with real-time weapon-driven combat, and those two game styles don't really mesh. At least, not in the way they're attempting here. Despite playing through this game 2 full times, I still always feel like I'm somehow doing something wrong, simply because enemies never react to my actions the way I would expect them to in a game like this. Even though you're visibly moving your characters around and swinging your weapons, making sprite-to-sprite contact with an enemy doesn't guarantee that your hit lands, since the game is still using turn-based JRPG dice rolls and arbitrary accuracy stats to determine whether you actually hit them or not, and this is just so at odds with what the player is actually seeing. Like, in a Zelda game, if my attack misses, it's because I aimed poorly, and I can accept that I made that mistake. Here, though, I can see that my weapon connected, but the game randomly decided it didn't count that time, and there's nothing I can do about that. In a traditional turn-based RPG, the player just sort of accepts that a lot of this stuff is all up to chance, but in an action game, which Secret of Mana clearly wants to be, incorporating blatantly randomized elements like this into standard combat is frustrating and disheartening even. Again, in Zelda, the number of hits required to kill each enemy is determined by 2 simple factors: which enemy I'm fighting, and which weapon I'm using. If an attack of mine does no damage in Secret of Mana, it's really anyone's guess as to why. Am I not positioned to strike their hitbox correctly? Were they still in their mercy frames from their last attack? Are my stats simply too low to have any effect? Is that enemy just immune to physical attacks? The game doesn't clearly communicate any of this information to the player, and so trying to problem solve it can oftentimes feel hopeless. It all combines into a situation I've never really encountered before in a video game. The game itself may not necessarily be buggy, but the game design makes it feel buggy because it feels like nothing is working. The difficulty scaling also feels really skewed. Early on, before you're even given access to magic or any additional party members, the game places these slime enemies in your path that have high physical defense, can split up an unlimited number of times, and can poison you on contact. I get that the game maybe just wants you to run from them until you're better equipped, as this is an area you'll return to a few times over, but god damn it if I didn't spend several minutes beating my head against a wall trying to defeat even one of these things at first. Enemies in general can also just plain stun lock you if you get outnumbered, and your AI party members aren't always great at getting you out of those situations. The Cave of Trials late in the game feels like a huge difficulty spike, with enemies that seem to be immune to everything I could possibly throw at them even though I was adequately leveled up. And a lot of the bosses are also really bad in terms of scaling. Oftentimes the most effective method to defeating bosses is to just spam whatever element of spell they're weak to, as bosses usually have high physical defense and odd hitboxes that make a physical assault tricky. And by doing this, most bosses are pretty easy, but if you're ever in a position where you're out of MP, you're basically screwed. And take this boss, the Wall Face, where you have to hit this eye in the middle while constantly taking assault from the 2 eyes on either side. One of the side eyes periodically heals the main eye, so you'd think taking that eye out would be the key to victory. But no, the main eye can just revive the side eyes whenever they die. The first time I got to this boss, I didn't have any MP left, since the enemies in the dungeon were resistant to physical attacks, and so I had used it all up already. And even with a naturally leveled party, simply playing through the game, fighting every enemy I came across, I still wasn't dealing nearly enough damage with my 3 characters to outpace the healing the boss was doing to itself. The boss's defense is so high, and its window of vulnerability opens so briefly, that there was simply no chance of me actually winning this fight without being able to spam magic. So, okay, clearly the bosses are designed under the assumption that you'll just use magic on them. Okay, fine. So, what happens when a boss is plopped in front of you before you're ever given any spells to begin with? Oh boy, let me tell you about the Spiky Tiger. The Spiky Tiger is the game's 3rd boss. The 2nd, really. The first boss is just a tutorial that you literally can't lose. And this guy is an absolute asshole. He spends most of his time camping just out of reach and spamming spells, and at this point you only have 2 long-range weapons to share among your 3 characters. And when he does finally get close enough for you to actually attack him, his attacks send him flying in unpredictable directions and can knock your characters to the ground for several seconds while he continues to just wail on you. This boss seems like it was designed under the assumption that you would just be able to spam spells on him, but he's placed at a point in the game where you don't have any spells yet. I have a full hour's worth of footage of nothing but me just trying to beat this one boss. And once I finally managed it, only one of my party members was still standing. While doing some Googling to find out what I might be doing wrong, I learned I'm definitely not the only person to hit a wall here, as both this and the aforementioned wall face are repeatedly brought up as 2 of the worst bosses in the game. Your only real option for winning here is to grind levels and healing items beforehand and just pray that he takes it easy on you the next time. Absolutely atrocious game design. And indeed, throughout most of the game, oftentimes your only real option is to just grind out your levels in magic. In fact, the walkthrough I was using would recommend sticking around and grinding out levels each time you upgrade a weapon or unlock a new spell, and no, I'm not going to do that. I shouldn't have to do that. First off, leveling weapons in general is just pretty useless past a certain point, since weapon level really only determines how much you can charge your weapon's power before attacking, and anything past level 2 or 3 is rarely worth it. Secondly, it's just a major pet peeve of mine with RPGs in general. If I'm doing everything I should be, defeating every enemy I come across, and shit, usually doing more than what the game is asking of me, why the hell should I ever need to grind? And sometimes grinding doesn't even help. The final boss is baffling to me. There's really no strategy for one thing, it's just a stat check more or less. But in addition to this, for narrative reasons, only Randy's weapon can actually hurt the thing. So your party members kind of just stand around being useless the whole time, and even at level 99, this fight took about 5 minutes longer than it really should have. So I mentioned earlier that the game isn't necessarily buggy, but I still encountered some pretty bad ones. Your AI party members are prone to getting snagged up on the scenery, which isn't necessarily a full-on glitch so much as just questionable AI programming, but there was a legitimate instance of one of my characters glitching into the scenery with no way to retrieve them, forcing a reset. One of the dragon bosses in the Pure Lands also decided to fly out of bounds where none of my weapons or spells could hit it, and then it refused to move at all, forcing me to reset. And in another instance, the game just flat out froze after I beat a boss, which, you guessed it, forced me to reset. And the game's somewhat buggy nature is speculated to be a result of its troubled development. See, Secret of Mana was originally planned for the then upcoming Super NES CD add-on, which Nintendo was in the works with Sony to produce. For reasons I'll no doubt get into in future videos, that ended up not coming to pass, and this left the future of Mana somewhat uncertain. The team briefly considered just cutting their losses and canceling the game, but instead they eventually settled on repurposing the game for standard SNES carts. And if you know anything about developing for CDs versus cartridges, you'll know this was easier said than done. In order to cram everything into the limited bytes of a cart, roughly 40% of the game's planned content was scrapped, and much of what had been completed up to that point needed to be redone from scratch anyway. The story was also significantly downsized. The final game sees almost no real character development, and perhaps more significantly, the idea of multiple story paths and endings had to be thrown out the window. Given the game's ambitious scope, this just wasn't going to be doable on a cartridge. And even the localization suffered from this unexpected hardware change. Ted Woolsey has lamented the stunted nature of Mana's English script, with most dialogue needing to be shaved down to its absolute most essential to fit the cartridge memory and text box limitations. Japanese is a very densely built language where entire words or even broad concepts can be expressed with just a handful of symbols, but English requires far more letters to express the exact same things. Woolsey described the act of chopping the game's script as akin to shuffling a novel. Combine that with the absurdly short 1-month deadline he was given to translate the entire game in time for the 1993 holiday season, and it's no wonder he's been quoted saying Mana's localization process practically killed him. Despite it all, though, I can 100% understand why so many people consider this game a classic, and why it's so close to the heart of many RPG fans. For one thing, the game is gorgeous. Backgrounds are rich and lively, your party members are all these really pleasant pastel colors, and every sprite is full of detail and animated wonderfully. It's one of the best looking SNES games, full stop. The soundtrack is also damn good. While FF Adventure composer Kenji Ito was initially slated to return for Mana, he had to decline due to already working on several projects at the time. So instead, Hiroki Kikuta was brought on board, and Mana was his first time creating music for a video game. And man, he really went above and beyond. The usual process of creating music for these old systems would involve the composer writing song demos using his own instruments or synthesizers, which would then be sent off to the sound programmers, who then recreate those compositions using the built-in samples of the console's native sound chip. Kikuta, though, took a completely hands-on approach. The absolute mad lad hand-created each and every instrument sample himself using SNES dev kits so he could personally hear exactly how the final product would sound. And he reportedly at times worked 24-hour days writing and editing music. The score itself is inspired by natural landscapes and uses a lot of bells, woodwinds, and pianos to create not only beautiful sweeping pieces for the lovely scenery you'll be traveling through, but also lively upbeat music for the various towns you'll find yourself in. He even used whale calls in the game's intro to communicate to the player right away that they were stepping foot into a whole new world. And he even synced up the opening theme with the fading of the title screen. The end product is truly a masterpiece, and Kikuta to this day considers it his favorite work. The game also just has an overall vibe to it that is absolutely infectious. The three main party members may not have much in the way of actual character arcs, thanks to the game's emergency downsizing, but all three are still pretty likable characters with clearly defined personalities and understandable motivations. Even though the dialogue and backstories in the game are very bare bones, when compared to the cast of, say, Final Fantasy V, I feel like I know way more about who these characters are as actual people. The Secret of Mana also just has a lot of charm and whimsy to it. Moogles show up as both NPCs and a status condition, which is a nice little nod to the game's Final Fantasy roots. And an entire dungeon of the game revolves around rescuing Santa Claus. And I don't mean like a mythical fantasy character who represents Santa Claus, I mean like Rudolph is there. This is actually just Santa Claus. And if that isn't just so fucking adorable. So, as for the question posed in the video title, did Secret of Mana win me over in the end? Well, honestly, I still don't know. I've played through the game twice now, and I don't feel any different now than I did the first time I finished it. I can see the appeal, for sure, and I understand what the game was trying to accomplish. But at the same time, it's not really something I can see myself revisiting anytime in the near future. I see the charm in it, I see the beauty, I see the ambition, but I think the final result is just a tad too clunky to hold up on its own. Unfortunately, I think where the game failed the most is in its battles, which is arguably the single most important aspect of a good RPG. But the game nails nearly everything else. Stunning visuals, beautiful music, charming world and characters. It may not be an amazing game per se, but it's absolutely a worthwhile experience. 1993 really was Sonic's year, man. If you're too young to remember, or more likely weren't even born yet, holy crap I'm old, I really can't even begin to adequately describe how big a deal Sonic was back then. Before the release of Sonic 1, Nintendo were the clear leaders in console video games. occupying a staggering 90% of the American market. But by the beginning of 1993, that percent had dropped to a mere 35. Sega of America had gained 60% of the market, marking the first time since the release of the NES that Nintendo wasn't at the top of the industry. And it was the release of Sonic that had gotten that ball rolling. Ha! Ball rolling, get it? I slay me. And after the franchise had seen 2 successful console video games, Sega of America went full steam with the Blue Blur. They greenlit not 1 but 2 simultaneous TV cartoons starring the character. One was dark and dramatic, and the other was a hilarious comedy about chili dogs, and the same guy played Sonic in both shows. Isn't that wild? The same guy playing 2 different versions of the same guy? They licensed out a comic book with Archie Comics, which would not only thrive throughout the Dark Age of Sonic and the Dark Age of Comics, but would also go on to be the longest-running comic book based on a video game, at 290 monthly issues over a span of 23 years, as well as a half-dozen spin-off comics and a crossover with Mega Man. Not to mention, there was a crap ton of Sonic toys and merchandise, and Sonic even got a float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, the first video game character in history to have the honor. Just maybe don't look into what happened to the float that year. How embarrassing, the one time Sonic failed to pass a lamppost. And even with all that going on, Sega had enough time left over to make sure Sonic was still making regular video game appearances. They clearly didn't want to risk the possibility of Sonic being just a fad, and wanted to capitalize on the franchise's instant popularity on all possible fronts. 1993 saw the release of a whopping 4 Sonic the Hedgehog video games across 3 consoles. Well, I guess 3.5 games really, but let's put a pin in that for now. The first of these games, and also the only one that could really be considered a mainline title, was Sonic CD, released for the Sega Mega CD in September 1993. The Mega CD, called simply the Sega CD in North America, was a CD-ROM add-on for the Genesis released in December 1991, which allowed the console to produce more power and CD-quality audio and music. Sonic CD was meant to be the console's first flagship title, as the peripheral had failed to sell substantial numbers in its first year and a half on the market. While Sonic teams Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara had departed Sega of Japan to join Sega Technical Institute in the States, Sonic's creator, Naoto Oshima, had stayed behind in Japan, and he was chosen to lead the team that would develop Sonic CD. Originally conceived as simply a souped-up Sega CD version of Sonic 1, Sega higher-ups considered the title more of a B project when compared to Sonic 2, and it's perhaps because of this that the project would graduate into an original game instead. Oshima reportedly received very little executive oversight for the game, and thus was essentially allowed to just make whatever he wanted. And after a long-distance phone call with his old colleague Yuji Naka, Oshima's team would end up using a lot of the ideas for Sonic 2 in their game as well, most notably the scrapped time travel concept, which would not only be featured prominently in this game, but would be its core driving gameplay mechanic. The plot of Sonic CD sees Sonic traveling to visit Little Planet, a mysterious extra-dimensional planetoid that appears over the skies of Neverlake for 1 month of the year. Aside from its perceived beauty, Little Planet is also said to be a place where time is not linear, with sceneries and environments often completely changing in the blink of an eye. Upon his arrival at Neverlake, however, Sonic is shocked to find Little Planet completely covered in machinery and chained to a nearby mountain, keeping it bound to this location. This was no doubt the work of Dr. Eggman, who was hoping to harness the power of Little Planet's time stones to keep it perpetually under his own rule. While Sonic tries to stop Eggman's schemes yet again, he must also rescue the young Amy Rose, who has been abducted by Dr. Eggman's latest and most deadly robotic creation, Metal Sonic. So right off the bat, we have the addition of 2 new characters. First up is Amy Rose, a young girl and a fan of Sonic, who travels to Neverlake after a tarot card reading predicts a meeting with her hero there. Amy was inspired by a character of the same name from the 1992 Sonic manga published by Shogakukan. The team was inspired to include a character who could act as the mini to Sonic's Mickey, but with a twist. While Amy is absolutely infatuated with Sonic, Sonic really shows no interest in her at all. Sonic lives for adventure and is always on the move, and though he's a good dude who always helps those in need, he's simply not interested in romance. Amy's desire for a relationship intentionally clashes with Sonic's impulsive and free-spirited nature, creating a somewhat unexpected dynamic between the two. It's a cool little subversion of a cartoon trope that had been around for decades at that point. What happens when you give a love interest to a character not interested in love? It also retroactively kind of becomes a commentary on parasocial relationships as well. Like, no, your favorite YouTuber is not actually your friend. Except me, of course. I'm your friend. Like and subscribe. Amy would continue to appear throughout the franchise, albeit somewhat sparingly and exclusively in spin-offs, up until being made a core character in the Sonic Adventure games, and she's been a mainstay in the cast ever since. In terms of design, unfortunately, I'm really not a fan of Amy's classic look. Overall, she's really just a pink Sonic, which, okay. And what is going on with her outfit? The actual clothes are fine, they fit the vibe of a young girl in a whimsical cartoon world, but there's just way too many clashing colors going on here. She's got a red headband, lime green shirt, orange skirt, and purple shoes. Holy hell. Look, pick any 2, maybe 3 of those colors, and you might have something, but as it is now, this is just way too much. Her reintroduction in Sonic Adventure would come with a complete makeover for her, and that's really a much better look if you ask me. That DLC costume for her in Sonic Superstars feels like it was made specifically to please me. Oh, and the American manual called her Princess Sally to tie the game in with the Archie comics and Saturday morning cartoon. And that's silly. From a marketing standpoint, I get it from the angle of, like, brand continuity or whatever, and I know Sally was actually pink for a bit, but these are blatantly not the same character to anyone with functioning eyes. The other new character, or machine, would of course be Metal Sonic, possibly Dr. Eggman's greatest creation. Naota Oshima wanted to introduce a character who could act as Sonic's, quote, greatest and eternal rival. And Metal Sonic is just that. Finally, Eggman created a machine that represents his own ideal vision of the Blue Blur, completely mechanized and totally subservient to him. And, most importantly, successfully equaling Sonic in his most notable trait, speed. And how did he do it? Well, by basically just building a tiny jet plane. Seriously, look at Metal. His torso is just a jet turbine. And that is not only a clever bit of writing and lore, but also just ingenious character design. The instruction manual even lists off specs for Metal Sonic like his CPU, engine output, and torque. And even though it's all clearly fanciful and exaggerated, it's an extra mile the developers didn't have to take, all in service of making the character feel that much more realized. His design is sleek and slender, but sharp and intimidating, with lots of harsh corners and straight lines to contrast with Sonic's curved and round body shapes. He doesn't run, but instead hovers above the ground. His nose and fingers are sharp cones of steel. His eyes are black voids of LCD pixels with harsh red rings for pupils, and he lacks any sort of visible mouth. Metal Sonic isn't here to talk, he's here to get shit done. This design has remained virtually unchanged throughout the decades, even as the rest of the cast received revisions to their looks a handful of times. Metal Sonic is a design that just nailed it on the first try. It's damn brilliant. Sonic would gain other rivals throughout the years, and even the idea of a robotic Sonic doppelganger is one that's been used multiple times, both before and after this game. In fact, all 4 classic mainline Sonic titles feature some sort of robotic Sonic double, but this is the one to stand the test of time and become the de facto version. This is the Metal Sonic. Sonic's moveset in Sonic CD is built very much like the previous 2 games, and Sonic's sprites are mostly reused from Sonic 1. He has the spin dash from Sonic 2, kind of. I think the phone call with Yuji Naka could only convey so much because this spin dash has none of the thrill or spectacle of Sonic 2's spin dash. It has to be fully charged or else nothing will happen, meaning it's a huge pace breaker as well. Moreover, Sonic was also given the Peel Out, a standing version of the spin dash that achieves a higher max speed and can be pulled out with less charge time. The Peel Out's downside, in theory, is that Sonic isn't rolling while using the move, meaning he's vulnerable to taking damage. But, like, there's nothing stopping you from just rolling into a ball once you get moving. So the Peel Out has essentially rendered the spin dash redundant. Looks really cool, though. Oh, and remember in my previous Sonic videos where I mentioned how tight the screen space can feel sometimes? Well, here, when you charge up the Peel Out or otherwise reach your top speed, the camera will actually pan forward so you can see more of the level ahead of you. And that extra split second of granted reaction time can really make all the difference sometimes. I'm astounded that no other 2D Sonic game has done this. In terms of structure, CD takes the basic gameplay loop from Sonic 1. High-speed side-scrolling action through open and intricate levels is the name of the game. but CD puts an interesting spin on things, no pun intended, by including a time travel mechanic. Throughout each stage are scattered various lampposts labeled either past or future, and once you pass one of those, maintaining your speed for around 5 seconds or so will carry Sonic to the designated point in time, the entire level changing around him. If your speed is interrupted, the process is cancelled and you have to locate another lamppost to try again. Standing in for the Chaos Emeralds this time are the 7 Time Stones, and collecting all of them is the only way to truly thwart Eggman. So if you want to, you can just play this game like Sonic 1, rushing to the end of each stage and collecting Time Stones if you want, defeating Eggman like usual. But to get the good ending, you'll need to secure a good future in each zone. Each level has 4 different versions you can travel between: the present, the past, and 2 possible futures. A good future, wherein Sonic has successfully stopped Eggman from taking over, or a bad future, where Eggman rules. Getting all the Time Stones retroactively achieves good futures on all stages and guarantees the better ending. But if you prefer, you can also individually travel to the past version of each level and locate the robot generators hidden there to achieve good futures as well. And it's because of all this that the level design in Sonic CD can get a bit eccentric. Levels have a lot of odd dead ends and side paths, and rings are often lodged into the scenery where they can't be collected. But this too ties towards that time travel technique, as those dead ends and rings will often be completely open and available if you find them in the past or future instead. And whether you choose to speed through each act or slow down and look for lampposts and generators, every level of the game is designed to accommodate either choice. There are various fast lanes to zip you across the landscapes, but each level is also completely backtrackable, so you can search for those generators. And I can't imagine this being an easy balancing act for the game designers, so kudos to them, truly. The major exception, though, is Wacky Workbench. Act 1 is designed around low-hanging pillars that you have to travel under, which is an interesting concept that subverts the usual high ground is the fastest level design of Sonic 1 and 2. The top paths here are all dead ends, and so sticking to the low path is the only way forward. But the floor is set up to launch you high up should you touch it. So the whole way you're dealing with these slow-moving platforms, and messing up even a single jump can slow down your run by potentially minutes. Act 2, thankfully, is a bit more traditional, but Wacky Workbench is still easily my least favorite level and a sole blemish on a string of levels that I think are all otherwise pretty good. And it's in the levels themselves where you can really start to see the remnants of the game's original plan to be a remake of Sonic 1. Almost all the level themes are recycled from that game. Seriously, think about it. Palm Tree Panic is Green Hill, Collision Chaos is Spring Yard, Tidal Tempest is Labyrinth, Stardust Speedway is Starlight, and Metallic Madness is Scrap Brain. If the numbering sequence in the level select screen is any indication, there was a level 2 that was cut at some point. I'm betting that would have been the Marble Zone stand-in, if this deleted scene from the ending is to be believed. But there are 2 levels in Sonic CD that could be considered completely original. One is Wacky Workbench, which is just another factory level, sure, but that bouncing floor gimmick hasn't been seen before. And the other is Quartz Quadrant, which is probably my favorite of the bunch. Just so cool visually, and the layout flows really well. In fact, ignoring Wacky Workbench, I don't think there's a single level here I dislike. You know there's some talent involved when even the underwater level doesn't suck. And this is the first Sonic game where the bosses really stick out to me in terms of game design. Sonic CD borrows from the Game Gear games in that Act 3 of each zone is a dedicated boss level, with just a short stretch of running and jumping before getting to Eggman. Each boss act holds at least 100 rings and an extra life box, as well as one of each type of power-up, and doesn't that just make you want to try and track them all down? But the bosses themselves are interesting in that most of them require very few actual hits to defeat. I think the most is around 4 or so. No, they're more about memorizing a certain pattern or gimmick and striking when the boss is vulnerable. The first boss is basically a freebie, while the second takes place on a full-fledged pinball table, with the goal of simply reaching Eggman at the top while breaking through barricades and evading falling bombs. My favorite example is Quartz Quadrant, where you don't actually need to hit Eggman at all, instead just dodge bombs while you run on this conveyor belt, gradually grinding down the bottom of the machine Eggman's standing in until he's forced to abandon ship. And of course, there's the race with Metal Sonic in Stardust Speedway. What a freaking great concept for a Sonic boss. Running and jumping through an obstacle course full of hazards while also avoiding attacks from Metal Sonic, and making sure not to fall behind enough for Eggman's death beam to catch up. Sonic was built for stuff like this, and this boss is always exciting and just challenging enough to be satisfying. If there is one major criticism I could levy at the gameplay of Sonic CD, though, it would be that the game doesn't offer the player enough incentive to travel into the future. In fact, it often feels like a punishment, since the robot generator you need to destroy in each stage is located only in the past. In theory, the good futures are smoother to run through and less obstructed by hazards, and since you've already destroyed the robot generator just to get there, most of the enemies will be gone as well. But if I've already gone to the trouble of traveling to the past and scouring the level for the generator, it seems like a big waste of time to then find a future post to travel to the present, then find another future post, and then travel to the future again, just to make my trip through the last, third of the act slightly easier. I don't think I've ever once gone out of my way to travel to the future in this game. The boss acts always take place in one of the two futures, whichever one you've earned for that zone, but besides that, I've never seen the future versions of these zones outside of using level select. Being made for the Sega CD came with a lot of advantages and quirks when compared to the standard Genesis titles. For one thing, Sonic CD is the first Sonic game to have a save feature, thanks to the built-in RAM of the Sega CD. The game won't remember which exact act you're on, nor what your score was, but it will keep track of good futures and time stones, and you can pick up from the beginning of the last zone you were on. This save feature also means that the game could include bonus modes and unlockables, such as a music player and cutscene viewer. And would you believe this is the only classic Sonic game to have a time attack mode? That's crazy, right? Two of the big selling points for CD-based games of the time was obviously the ability for CD-quality audio and music, but also for full-motion video playback. As such, Sonic CD features full opening and ending sequences by Toei Animation, or more specifically Studio Junyo, albeit the versions in the final game have a lot of bit compression to be able to fit it all in there. Really though, doesn't that just give them a certain bit of charm in its own way? The special stages here were also a great showcase of the Sega CD's capabilities. Entering the stages follows the Sonic 1 method of carrying 50 rings to the end of the stage, but the stages themselves are completely new and a technical wonder for their time. You control Sonic in a 3D environment as he tries to defeat a handful of UFOs before time runs out, and touching any body of water will subtract from your remaining time as well. These things are a real visual tour de force, and they don't feel bad to play either. Unfortunately, the hitboxes on the UFOs can be a bit misleading. The actual contact point is deceptively small compared to the sprites you're being shown, and Sonic's steering is very rigid, making 180-degree turns basically impossible. But as far as classic-era special stages go, Sonic CDs are my favorite. The game's soundtracks are also really strong thanks to the CD format. And yes, that was a plural I just used, because Sonic CD actually features region-specific music. The original Japanese soundtrack, which was carried over into the European version, was largely made up of Eurobeat-inspired electronic dance music, but Sega of America felt this choice of genre was becoming too trendy and overdone, and so decided to replace the majority of the game's music. Composer Spencer Nilsson was hired to rescore the game's soundtrack, and collaborating with female vocal trio Pastiche, he created a score that was much more surreal, ambient, and dreamlike. And they created a new main theme for the game titled Sonic Boom. Being on a CD, the music didn't need to be generated by the console itself, like it would be on the Genesis, so the act of replacing them all was as simple as just swapping out the game's music files. They weren't able to replace every song, though. The Japanese soundtrack was structured so that each stage's 4 time periods used different arrangements of the same composition, with the future versions sounding more advanced and the past versions sounding more primitive. They even got clever with this by having the past tracks not use CD audio at all, but instead use the built-in music generator, like a standard Genesis game would. Ergo, it was playing music of the past using an outdated method, get it? But because of this, the US version couldn't replace those past versions of the songs, at least not without a lot of time and effort, since those pieces were baked into the game itself, so they had to leave them be. As for which I prefer, well, as much as it sounds like a cop-out, I think they're both really good. They're just so different it doesn't even feel right to compare them. Probably my favorite instance of this juxtaposition is listening to the tracks for Metallic Madness. Couldn't be further off from one another, and it's kinda hilarious, honestly. I usually play with the Japanese music just because I enjoy the more high energy and irreverent feel it gives off, but the Nilsson score's dreamlike quality meshes really well with the game's overall vibe, which is often filled with a lot of surreal imagery itself. And let's be honest, Sonic Boom is a way better song than whatever the fuck the Japanese themes were supposed to be.
What do you mean? Give and take, going home, side zone, check it out, eh? Live alone, leather legs, get in place. What do you get, say? Back it, zoom room, cosmic zoom, that's up, James.
Of course, there is at least one major downside when dealing with CD-ROMs: load times. This most obviously results in every level being preceded by several seconds of black nothing, but that's not all. Any CD-based music takes a second to start up, so each level starts in silence for a bit, and the music also can't loop. Every track fades out when it reaches the end and has to play from the beginning whenever it's interrupted. I never once got to hear the end of the level clear jingle because it always loaded too late.
Yes!
And this can even affect gameplay. The jingles for invincibility and speed-ups are normally an indicator for the player to determine how long the effect will still be active, but that doesn't really work if the music doesn't start right away. Even beyond the music, though, the load times did also affect how the game was actually designed and programmed. Naoto Oshima's original vision for time travel was that the level would seamlessly change around Sonic in the blink of an eye, inspired by the film Back to the Future, but his team had to let him know that this wouldn't be possible on a CD. So the final game unfortunately has to buffer any instance of time travel with an animation and a loading screen. Oshima has been quoted saying that had Yuji Naka been working on the game, he would have been able to find a way to fix this. And honestly, it's kinda sweet that he showed that kind of faith in his colleague, even if Yuji Naka is a petty asshole. Aesthetically, Sonic CD is especially unique even among the classic Sonic titles, and it's one of my favorites in the franchise graphically. When I think of what classic Sonic art design should look like, Sonic CD is what comes to mind. The game also has a lot of neat little flourishes that just add that extra bit of character to the whole thing. Defeating enemies doesn't release trapped animals, but instead plants a flower in their wake, and so when you destroy that robot generator, the level turns into an idyllic garden. But if you do miss the little critters, you can find and destroy the metal Sonic holograms hiding in the past of each act. Doing so does nothing in the long run, but it brings all the local wildlife out of hiding to really liven up the scenery. You'll sometimes see worn down or decrepit robots in the present and future, and these robots often move slower and even behave more erratically, and it's cool to see the game designers really embracing the game's central concept like this. Metallic Madness Act 2 has this set piece with a shrinking laser, and sure, there's not much point to it, but goddammit if it ain't charming. Sonic has this unique jumping sprite if you go down this ramp in Palm Tree Panic, that's neat. And Sonic CD even expands on the character's idle animation. If the player for whatever reason doesn't touch the controller for 3 full minutes, Sonic will get fed up and jump off the screen, granting a game over. This is even accompanied by the first instance of the character speaking a voiced line of dialogue.
I'm out of here!
And honestly, it's just not a Sonic game to me if Sonic isn't at least a little bit of a dick. Sonic CD would end up selling over 1.5 million copies, which made it the highest-selling Sega CD game. And while that might sound impressive to some, it wouldn't be enough to make the console a success. For comparison, the highest-selling Genesis game sold 15 million units, and the best-selling Super Nintendo game sold 20 million. If your console's best-selling game isn't even breaking 2 mil, the writing on the wall is pretty clear. Due to this, Sonic CD would become somewhat elusive and obscure for quite a few years. Of the classic mainline Sonic titles, it's seen the fewest number of re-releases, likely due to the complicated nature of porting or emulating Sega CD games in general. It received a Windows 95 port in 1996, which featured minor visual and performance upgrades, and this was actually the version I owned as a kid. This PC version would then be included in Sonic Gems Collection in 2005, the first ever console re-release of the game in 12 years. The game was later rebuilt from the ground up by Christian Whitehead and his team for mobile phones, Xbox Live, and PSN in 2011. and most recently was included in Sonic Origins in 2022. That's a mere 3 re-releases since 1993. Absolutely paltry compared to Sonic 1 and 2 being ported to every console, handheld, phone, and kitchen appliance dozens of times over the last 30 years. While the game has always done fairly well with critics, Sonic CD's reception among fans has seemed to shift over time. Back in the days where the game simply wasn't easily available to most people, it held this certain reputation as something of a white whale, a hidden gem that was tragically lost to history. This gave the game a certain sense of mystique, of intrigue. It wasn't uncommon to hear talk of the best Sonic game ever made being stuck on a console nobody owned. But with the release of Gems Collection, and especially the Whitehead port, the game was finally available to a widespread mainstream audience. And with the loss of that obscurity it always held, came a sudden wave of criticism from people who were playing it for the first time after years of older fans hyping it up. Safe to say, modern critical discourse around Sonic CD is much more mixed these days. Many fans don't seem to be too fond of the game's more exploratory gameplay or its sometimes erratic stage design. Somehow, the time travel mechanic sees criticism on two opposite fronts. Some see it as an intrusive pace breaker, while others complain that it's completely pointless and easily ignored. So which is it? Does it get in the way or is it not present enough? Because it can't be both. As for me, well, this is gonna sound mean, but I think most of the people complaining about Sonic CD are just kinda bad at the game. Sonic CD, to me, is the only classic Sonic game to offer so many different valid ways to play and multiple methods to accomplish your goals. Like I said earlier, if you want to just play the game like Sonic 1, you absolutely can. But really delving into the time travel mechanic, learning how it works, and getting really good at it is one of the most satisfying experiences in this franchise. As much as I love fan-favorite Sonic 3, that game's levels are much more linear and driven by spectacle and cinematic set pieces, which makes initial playthroughs exciting, but turns repeat plays into kind of a drag. Sonic CD, though, is a game you can play over and over and still find something new. To collect footage, I played the game 4 times, and none of those runs looked even remotely the same. And I've played it probably close to 100 times over the years and have never once gotten tired of it. Each time I play, I find myself asking, do I want to get all the generators this time? The time stones? Both? Neither? Do I want to hunt down all the Metal Sonic holograms just to see all the animals frolicking? Should I see if I can actually travel to the good future of every zone, or should I just race to the finish? There's real, actual depth here, and it's just really interesting to have a side-scrolling 2D platformer that gives me honest-to-God options for how I want to play. If you've never played the game, give it a try and play around for a bit. I think you'll find a lot here to like. And if you've already played Sonic CD and maybe didn't like it so much, I urge you to give it another go. Set aside your preconceptions of what a classic Sonic game should be, and really try to play the game on its terms instead of your terms. Once you engage with the game's systems and realize how they all mesh together, I think you'll be surprised to find yourself itching to try it again and again. About a month after the release of Sonic CD, we got Sonic Chaos, the third entry in the adjacent Game Gear side series of Sonic titles. Sega was keeping diligent about having a new portable Sonic game each year to accompany that year's big console title, and developer Aspect was again hired for the job here. As this game was the follow-up to the Game Gear Sonic 2, it went under the working title of Sonic 3, but this was changed to avoid being confused with the actual Sonic 3, which was still in development and wouldn't be out until the following year. In Japan, it would go by the title Sonic and Tails, and I gotta say, I've never seen a game where both regional titles end up being completely ungoogleable, but here we are. Sonic Chaos plays identically to the previous Game Gear titles, Sonic 2 specifically, but with the major addition of Tails as a playable character. The Spin Dash makes its portable debut, and Sonic also has a tweaked version of the peel-out called the Strike Dash, which works similarly but grants Sonic invincibility for a split second upon takeoff. Tails' flight ability was also integrated into the gameplay, allowing Tails to gain unrestricted height for a few seconds, and this was the first time Tails' flight was an actual playable mechanic. There's also a new power-up exclusive to Sonic, the Rocket Shoes, which propel him through the air at high speed for a few seconds, often allowing you to zip across large sections of level. Special stages are back after being absent from the handheld Sonic 2, but they are notably only accessible with Sonic. Upon collecting 100 rings in any act, you'll be transported to the special stage. And the stages don't follow any single set formula. Instead, they each offer their own unique puzzle or gimmick to overcome, tasking you with finding and retrieving the Chaos Emerald within a certain time limit. One just simply gives you a pair of rocket shoes, tells you to go nuts to find the emerald at the end. One is akin to a standard level act, and you have to run and platform your way to the end of the stage without falling into any of the pits along the way. Another has you bouncing onto higher and higher platforms as you climb your way to the emerald at the top. There are 5 special stages in total, with the 6th and final emerald being granted upon defeating Eggman in the game's final zone. Accessing a special stage also lets you skip the remainder of the current act regardless of whether you retrieve the emerald or not, so in a way they can even be used to skip levels. As for the zones themselves, Sonic Chaos is probably the easiest Sonic game I've ever played. Levels were made much shorter in this one, and while they tried to make up for this by providing denser level layouts with more alternate and interconnecting pathways, it wasn't uncommon for my first blind run through an act to be over in around 30 seconds. The special stages requiring 100 rings to enter meant every act had to be absolutely chock full of them. Seeing groups of 4 or 5 ring boxes lined up in a row was a regular occurrence. Boss acts were also made easier simply because they actually provide rings this time. If you're trying to get all the emeralds, the game can get a bit tricky, since that does require at least some memorization of level layouts and ring locations, but otherwise, the game is a breeze. You could knock this one out in an afternoon. With Sega so determined to see a Sonic game released on every possible platform, Sonic CD and Sonic Chaos wouldn't be enough. They needed another Genesis Sonic game too. Following the success of Sonic 2, the folks at Sega Technical Institute had pitched a spin-off pinball title, inspired by that game's very own Casino Night Zone. Yuji Naka initially shot the idea down, preferring that the team focus on developing Sonic 3 instead, but when Sonic 3 ended up being pushed back to the following year, Naka agreed to let the pinball game be made in order to fill the gap left behind. Sonic Spinball was developed entirely by American STI members, making it the first Sonic title to be 100% born and bred USA, baby! You can really see this in the game's visual design, which is a lot more grungy and grimy, fitting right in with the style of much of American early 90s pop culture. Sonic's design here also clearly leans far closer to the American-made Greg Martin box arts than it does the Japanese Naoto Oshima designs. And characters from the American cartoons even appear in the bonus stages. The music was composed by Howard Drawson, STI's first in-house music composer, and it's all fine. None of the tracks really stick out in my memory, other than the options menu music being a bit of a meme simply due to how grating the instrumentation is. Early on, Drawson had reportedly used the Sonic 2 title theme for this game's title screen as well, but when one of the Japanese staff saw the finished game, they remarked, "How did you get permission to use that?" To which Drawson replied, what? Yeah, Sega doesn't actually own the rights to any of the music for Sonic 1 or 2. Masato Nakamura and his band do. Drawson had no idea, and the game even had early carts produced with Nakamura's music before being pulled and changed last minute, so that's fun. In terms of gameplay, Sonic Spinball is exactly as advertised. It's pinball with Sonic. Now, as you listen to me talk about this game and watch the footage being played, let me just say, I'm bad at pinball. I can say it. I just am. That being said, this game doesn't really control quite the same as a real pinball table. Obviously, Sonic isn't just a pinball, he's a character, and so he can run, jump, and spin dash whenever he finds some ground flat enough to do so, and can also slightly influence his trajectory in midair by steering left or right. But the pinball physics in this game are all very lethargic and floaty, even after setting the speed to the highest setting. I could never quite get used to it. The game consists of 4 tables, each with the goal of interacting with certain spots on the board to open the way to the Chaos Emeralds, which will allow you to pinball your way up to the boss at the top. The list of objectives on each table can get pretty lengthy, and with only 3 balls granted to the player to gather all the emeralds and defeat the boss, it can take a lot of time, effort, and plain old luck to be able to pull it off. And, just to reiterate, I'm bad at pinball. The various boards will often feature gimmicks to interact with, sometimes even required to finish, with probably the most blatant example being these clucks in Lava Powerhouse. You have to use the steam jets at the bottom of this chamber to launch yourself straight above a cluck, which you then bounce off of to gain enough height to be sucked into this pipe here. And this part made me irrationally angry. You need to do this several times over the course of this table, and for the life of me, I could not find a way to pull it off consistently. Getting the timing and the angle just right without being flung off in a random direction seemed damn near random at times. I honestly don't have much to say about this game, because, again, I'm bad at pinball, but if you are a person who is not me, and who is, in fact, good at pinball, I don't know, maybe you'll have fun with this one? The fourth and final Sonic-related game to be released in 1993 was, in fact, not really a Sonic game at all. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine was an Americanized reskin of a Japanese Tetris-style puzzle game called Puyo Puyo. The object of Puyo Puyo is to line up beans of matching colors in groups of 4 to clear out rows before your chamber gets filled. Pretty standard puzzle game stuff. But where Puyo Puyo has the edge over Tetris is that it's inherently designed to be competitive. 2 players, either human or CPU, compete to fill the other player's chamber while keeping their own empty. And by chaining together combos of beans in one fell swoop, you can send more of these black beans your opponent's way, which can only be removed by clearing out a bean directly adjacent to them. It builds on the quick thinking and score building of Tetris by also making the player think about how best to gain the advantage over their opponent and set up multiple combos. Puyo Puyo was a fairly popular game in Japan, and was probably Tetris's most competent rival within the puzzle gaming space. But American game companies weren't convinced the game's look and characters would be an easy sell for 1990s America. When Sega of America brought the game over, they decided to reskin it using the Sonic brand. More specifically, Dr. Robotnik, and even more specifically, the version of Dr. Robotnik seen in The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon. Every level is preceded by these short cutscenes where one of Robotnik's robots taunts you before challenging you to a bout of falling beans. It's just what made sense for the American market at the time. Nintendo of America even did something similar by changing the Super Nintendo version of Puyo Puyo into Kirby's Avalanche. But in terms of gameplay, it's still just Puyo Puyo, and that's great. I like Puyo Puyo. I'm not particularly great at Puyo Puyo, but I like it. Gee, Andrew, what games are you good at? Hey, shut up. Puzzle games in general can be super addictive, and I found myself easily getting hooked on this one. As you get to the later levels, though, the CPU just starts to blatantly cheat. As a human player, you have to juggle a lot of different things at once, like processing which combination of colors is falling, which direction to rotate it, and where best to place it to set up a combo. A CPU player doesn't have to worry about any of that. They just set each piece exactly where it needs to go 100% of the time, and the only way to throw a wrench into their plans is to set up a combo on them before they set one up on you. I have fun with the game, but I'd be lying if I said I ever have any actual idea what I'm doing. I'll be real, I'm pretty sure most of my wins were just pure luck. Despite being a Puyo Puyo game in disguise, Mean Bean Machine would be embraced by the larger Sonic franchise. Some examples being a Mean Bean-themed boss fight in Sonic Mania, and Sonic being an unlockable character in Puyo Puyo Tetris 2.
Try to keep up.
There was a Game Gear version released simultaneously with the Genesis version, with the obvious difference being the graphics and lack of cutscenes. But they're otherwise the same game. I beat both for the sake of collecting footage, because I don't value my own free time apparently, but there's really no reason for you to play more than one version. Safe to say, 1993 was one of Sonic's biggest years. Fans were eating good back then. It's really interesting looking back at a time when the Sonic franchise was not only active and thriving, but also experimenting with multiple media ventures and varied genres of games. About every half-decade or so, Sonic kinda dips out for a few years with only very sparing releases, so any year where we get this much Sonic content is one worth highlighting. Luckily for fans, 2023 was a pretty active year for the Blue Blur as well, and I can only hope we'll see plenty more like these to come. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Nothing is certain except death and taxes." If he were alive in the 1990s, he'd have also included yearly Mega Man sequels. Mega Man 6 is the last of the second NES trilogy of Mega Man games, and it does bring more originality than Mega Man 5. In fact, if you ask me, it's the best of the second trilogy. Even so, Capcom apparently had no faith in this one, choosing not even to release Mega Man 6 outside of Japan. It was thanks to Nintendo of America that the title was published here at all, and Europe didn't get it until a frickin' 3DS Virtual Console. Mega Man 6 is pretty much just as unremarkable and copy-paste as the two previous entries, to the point where there have been several rumors of it just being a heavy edit of Mega Man 5. The menu graphics and interface have been noticeably overhauled though, and the Rush adapters were added, allowing Mega Man to combine with Rush for either vertical mobility or increased damage output. But all in all, they're really just different tools for the same obstacle course. Beat returns too, which is fine, he's still a good bird. And unlocking him this time involves finding alternative boss doors in specific levels, which are usually hidden and or harder to reach. The levels are alright, the music is good, bosses are as expected at this point. Is this starting to sound familiar yet? Speaking of bosses, I couldn't help but notice that the Robot Masters in this one feel a bit rehashy. The weapons are mostly good, but when you stop to think about it, that's kind of because they just reused all the best weapons from previous games. And Capcom has also long dropped any pretenses of in-game lore when it comes to these robots. Flame Man, Blizzard Man, and Plant Man are all concepts that have been used before, with Plant Man and his weapon just blatantly being Woodman again. Centaur Flash is just Flashman's weapon again, meaning it's effective against the one Robot Master that's weak to it and nothing else. The Silver Tomahawk, though, is an excellent weapon with great damage, good range, and low ammo usage, but it's not as broken as the Metal Blade. The Tomahawk and many other weapons can also bypass shielded enemies, of which there are a lot in this entry. Combined with the power adapter and beat, Mega Man 6 really does let you go wild with whatever weapons you want, which is a welcome change of pace. So as well as Nintendo of America being responsible for bringing the game to the US at all, Nintendo Power was also responsible for two Robot Masters designed by people outside of Japan. Nightman and Windman both originated in America, and as such, the North American box art prominently features them, which is honestly kinda cool. Mega Man 6 also seemed to be easier than the other games in general. Maybe it was just me, maybe the Stockholm Syndrome has finally kicked in and I'm just not awful at these games anymore, but bosses seemed like complete cakewalks as long as you were using their correct weaknesses. The game was also a fair bit more generous with providing E-Tanks. I noticed that every Wily level had at least one. The new energy balancer also automatically allocates any weapon ammo you pick up to the weapon most in need of it, with no need to switch to the favored weapon beforehand, and I don't know, seems a bit odd to me to have an optional collectible perform a function that really should have been made standard like 4 games ago, but hey, what do I know? These last few Mega Man games have honestly been so repetitive that even my reviews have essentially started being the same. But yes, despite some impressive weapon variety and interesting world building, namely that civilization at a global scale does still exist and that people other than Doctors Light, Wily, and Cossack can make robots, Mega Man 6 still feels unnecessary. I'm almost disappointed these games weren't unplayable wrecks, because at least that would be something to talk about. But, right around the corner, Mega Man would see a new entry that would forever change the future course of the franchise. Mega Man was struggling at this point. It wasn't subtle. The last 3 games had been serviceable but uninspired, released on an aging and outdated system. The blatant copy-paste habits of the main entries were hard to ignore. And we also haven't even touched on the Game Boy Mega Mans, which were literally condensed and rearranged versions of the NES games. Keiji Inafune was still the series' lead artist and planner, but with their latest entry, the team focused on making something different. A complete reboot of the series that would allow for making real, substantial changes to the Mega Man formula, with more of a focus on story and world building. And what they ended up creating was a true revitalization of a long stagnant series. Mega Man X was released on December 17, 1993, 6 years to the day from the release of the original Mega Man. And yeah, it's pronounced X, not 10, but it sure confused people, many wondering when Mega Man 7, 8, and 9 had released. We just got number 6 a few months ago. Mega Man X takes place around 100 years after the classic Mega Man games, with the final creation of the late Dr. Light, the titular Mega Man X, awakening from a stasis intended to make sure the fully sentient and free-thinking robot would indeed only be a force for good. And before you even get to the title screen, the game's intro is masterfully understated. It's moody, it's intriguing, it's mysterious. It really makes you feel like you've discovered Dr. Light's old computer yourself. In this distant future, Dr. Light's work has been reverse engineered by one Dr. Kane, who has used this technology to create his own replica androids, or Reploids, several of which end up using their free will to commit acts of violence. Exactly what Dr. Light feared would happen to X. And these rogue Reploids would be branded as Mavericks. As such, a group of Reploids known as Maverick Hunters would rise up to rein in these rogue robots, led by Dr. Kane's greatest creation named Sigma. However, upon discovery of a red Maverick sealed away in a capsule very similar to X's, a mysterious Reploid virus would soon begin to spread, changing more and more of the robots into Mavericks through malfunction. Unfortunately, Sigma himself would contract the virus, making him the most powerful Maverick yet seen. Sigma would go on to lead a massive Reploid rebellion, and the red Maverick, known only as Zero, would choose to head the Maverick Hunters in his place. Our hero X, normally a staunch pacifist, chooses in these desperate times to join forces with Zero in order to subdue the Mavericks and storm Sigma's fortress, facing off against the evil robot Vile in the process, who we totally promise is not just a purple Boba Fett. Zero was originally designed by Keiji Inafune with the intent to be the new Mega Man, but he and the team feared the character might be too radical a departure, and fearing fan backlash, they designed the more traditional-looking X as well. But it seems like the team didn't really have much to worry about because Zero would prove to be a very popular character, even receiving his own spin-off series in the future. At a fundamental level, the core gameplay loop in Mega Man X is the same. You still run, jump, and shoot through 8 levels, each guarded by a boss that gives you a special weapon that is effective against another one of the bosses. But significant additions and upgrades have been made, and the first is that there is now an opening stage before the core 8 stages. And let me tell you, this is one of the best choices the team at Capcom made, to the point where it's even adopted by the classic series after this. Everything is crafted to teach you what to do and let you figure things out without explicitly telling you how to play the game. Discoveries are made organically and stick with the player that much more as a result. Look, we've all seen the sequelitis video, so I won't paraphrase it here, just know that it's really great game design. The game has also been crafted around an entirely overhauled moveset for X, and this did the game designers a lot of favors. Like, in the classic games, the charge shot always felt sort of out of place, but here the game is clearly built with it in mind. In fact, once you achieve the Buster upgrade, you can even charge your special weapons for additional effects, such as the Rolling Shield's Barrier or Chameleon Sting's Cloak, which grants you temporary intangibility. Mega Man can cling to walls and jump from them to gain additional height, and these can even be chained together, making both basic traversal and dodging enemy attacks much more dynamic. Upon acquiring the Leg upgrade, X can also dash, possibly the most essential of the new movement options, as the additional speed gained also carries into your jumps and, weirdly, doubles the damage of your Buster Shot, although that second thing is very likely some sort of bug. With all these new capabilities came a new control scheme, taking full advantage of the SNES's controller layout. You can now quick change between special weapons with no need to enter the pause menu, which saves a lot of time by allowing you to cycle through your artillery on the fly. This may be a matter of taste, but I never stick with the default control scheme in this game. Having both dash and jump set to face buttons makes frequent dash jumps awkward and uncomfortable, and so I set dash to one of the shoulder buttons instead. Makes it so much easier. As a result, I move weapon switching to X and Y instead of L and R, and that's never given me any problems. The game also still uses password saves, which even in 1993 seemed a bit outdated, but it's not like the game is super long, so I'm willing to overlook this here. X can also receive long-term upgrades hidden throughout the various stages. There's permanent health ups in the form of heart tanks, which is nice, but also new sub-tanks, which are basically refillable energy tanks, and this is such a cool idea. In the classic games, it was always just a little bit frustrating to see an enemy drop energy refills when you're already at full health, but now any energy you pick up while you're topped off will be deposited into your empty sub-tanks. Plus, now each sub-tank only needs to be found once, since using one merely empties it instead of removing it from your inventory entirely. This makes you less hesitant to use them in non-emergency situations, such as to top yourself off before a tough enemy or boss, since energy drops tend to be plentiful. There's also armor parts, such as the aforementioned buster and leg upgrades, but also an armor upgrade that cuts incoming damage in half, which is guarded by a mini-boss that is a huge damage sponge and takes far longer to beat than any other boss in the game. Seriously, what the hell is up with this thing? There's also a helmet upgrade that lets you break overhead blocks like you're frickin' Mario. Certain stages also host ride armors, exosuits that you can pilot which absorb damage for X and can punch everything in sight. They can also be sacrificed to give X an additional jump, just like Yoshi. All the function without any of the guilt. Just like the classic series, there are 8 main bosses to defeat, and each Maverick is themed after some sort of flora or fauna as opposed to just a general concept like the classic Robot Masters. In this first entry in particular, a few of them even seem like remakes of Mega Man 1 bosses, right down to the weapons you gain from them. Chill Penguin is Iceman, Flame Mammoth is Fireman, Spark Mandrill is Elecman, and Boomer Kuwanger is Cutman. With the addition of charged special weapons, every boss gives you more tools than ever before. And even if you miss the Buster upgrade in Flame Mammoth stage, Zero will give you his Z-Buster later on, which functions identically. What's more, bosses can be permanently crippled by exposure to the Boomerang Cutter. Flame Mammoth loses his trunk, and Launch Octopus will have his tentacles severed. Every weapon in this game is useful in some way or another, and they all feel fairly balanced, especially Storm Tornado and Homing Torpedo. Oh, I'm sorry, Horming Torpedo. Chameleon Sting deserves special mention again because even once you've used the charge version to become invincible, you can still fire regular shots. But honestly, if you want to go around and hit enemies with a sled made of ice carved to look like a penguin, you could do that too. Fuck, I love this game. After beating all 8 Mavericks, you move on to Sigma's Fortress. And notably, it's not a gauntlet this time. The game gives you a new password between each stage and leaves you free to revisit other stages to refill sub-tanks and extra lives in between. And pro tip, the best place to do this is Armored Armadillo's stage. The bat enemies here are prone to dropping large energy refills, and one among them is actually a hidden Batten enemy from the classic games, which drops a free extra life every time you defeat it. During the Sigma stages, you beat the 8 stage bosses again just like the old games. Though much like the original Mega Man, the bosses are scattered throughout the stages instead of the capsule room that had become the standard. All the classic Mega Man ingredients are here, but in a whole new dish unlike any we'd tasted before. While you are encouraged to beat the Mavericks in weakness order like in any other Mega Man game, the game offers you several incentives to break away from that habit. First off, beating certain levels can affect other levels. For example, beating Chill Penguin will cause snow to cool the lava in Flame Mammoth stage, removing major hazards and freeing up the path to a heart tank. Beating Storm Eagle will cause his airship to crash into and cut off power throughout Spark Mandrill stage. And beating Launch Octopus will cause areas of Sting Chameleon stage to flood. This is such a great idea that hasn't really been explored to the same degree in later entries, and frankly I'm at a loss as to why. There are also certain upgrades that can only be accessed with certain weapons or abilities, meaning returning to old stages will sometimes be required to pick up items you couldn't get the first time. Older Mega Man games clearly had correct orders to tackle the stages, with the only real decision for the player being which boss on the weakness loop they should fight first. Here, you can choose to follow weakness order as usual, or maybe instead choose to finish the stage that makes a later one easier, or even plan out a path that minimizes backtracking. What's this? Depth? In a Mega Man game? Hold on, champ, that there is dangerous thinking. Unfortunately, there was one game design decision made that kinda throws a wrench into all of that. Locking the dash behind the leg upgrade really hurt things, as the dash is such an essential tool in tackling basically any stage of the game. The dash upgrade is in Chill Penguin's stage, and considering clearing that stage also makes Flame Mammoth stage easier, that makes Penguin stage the de facto first choice for almost any playthrough, regardless of which order you were planning to do. In every subsequent X game, dashing is a default mechanic. It's that integral to the gameplay. It's very evident that the team even knew how important the dash was. The leg upgrade is the only one that you can't miss. Even if you use a password to skip the leg armor upgrade, X will still have it in the ending sequence. Dash jumping and dash wall jumping opened so many mobility options for exploration and combat. It was such a refreshing change that also sped up the basic movement and flow of the game as a whole. And keeping that function hidden behind what's essentially a collectible was a bad move. There is also a secret endgame super weapon hidden in the game, only available once you collect every last upgrade. You can learn how to do the Hadouken from Street Fighter, with the proper button command and all, whenever X is at full health, and this attack can one-hit kill any enemy in the game aside from the final boss. I get that this is meant to be some super secret ultimate attack, but if you ask me, it's a bit too hidden. To organically discover this upgrade on your own, you would need to spontaneously decide to keep going through Armored Armadillo stage for no reason, to do a specific jump off a minecart near the end, and then kill yourself, repeating the process 4 times before the capsule appears. I'm lost as to how they expected anyone to learn about this in the days before the internet. The Hadouken also isn't preserved with passwords, so if you quit the game after this point, you'll have to go through that whole process again. The Hadouken does come with the only audible voice line in the game though, because even X knows that announcing your special attack gives it more power. And because this is a new console, this means that the graphics and sound all got upgrades, and those 16-bit sprites reflect it. The new setting also provided an opportunity for new art direction, and Mega Man X definitely has a harder edge than the classic games. More Gundam than Astro Boy. Every music track in the game is amazing, with each piece distinct enough and frenetic enough to be burned into my eardrums. I will always remember songs like the intro stage, Spark Mandrill, Boomer Kuwanger, and Storm Eagle. And Sigma is no slouch either, as his first encounter theme is almost non-stop beats, and it's quite catchy. You know, if you don't throw a Hadouken at him and end the fight immediately. Looking back, I can only imagine the reason the latter NES trilogy of Mega Man games were so cookie-cutter was because the bulk of the creativity and effort was going towards this one. And if that is why Mega Man 4 through 6 were so basic and bland, I don't want to say this was equivalent exchange, but I'll heavily imply it. The story and characters here are more developed, the world feels more fleshed out, and the gameplay is the most fun I've ever had in this series, before or since. Everything feels so responsive and intuitive, which honestly feels a bit unusual for Mega Man, no offense. There are a few technical issues, such as slowdown in a few spots, but this is the Mega Man of the future. The Mega Man we'd been waiting for, and the Mega Man Dr. Light and Keiji Inafune set out to give to the world. Mega Man X is the standard to which I hold every other Mega Man game and action platformers in general, and that's not an uncommon stance. Mega Man X was the breath of fresh air this franchise had so desperately needed, and it proved that you can revitalize a long-running franchise without completely reinventing the core gameplay. It still ticked all the checkboxes, it just added and expanded on everything so much that it feels like a completely new experience. There's no reason not to give this game a shot, as it is, in my opinion, the pinnacle of Mega Man.